They dragged her through the square at dawn, bound like livestock, bleeding into the dust. The whole town gathered to watch Lydia Vale's final humiliation, punishment for the sin of an empty womb. Her husband held the rope. The preacher held his silence, and Dry Hollow held its breath, waiting for her to break. But when the stranger's knife flashed in the morning light, cutting through more than just hemp and leather, everything changed. Some say that's when the town started dying. Others say that's when one woman finally started to live. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Lydia's story travels. And if this opening grabbed you, hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't believe where this goes. The rope burned, not the one around her wrists. Those had gone numb an hour ago, when Jacob first lashed them behind her back in the darkness of their cabin. No, the rope that burned was the one looped around her waist, the thick hemp line her husband now gripped as he pulled her through the center of Dry Hollow, like a farmer dragging a stubborn mule to slaughter. Lydia's bare feet scraped against the hard-packed dirt of Main Street. She'd lost her shoes somewhere between the cabin and the livery, maybe near the creek, maybe at the edge of town where the road turned from path to performance stage. Her dress, already threadbare from 3 years of rough marriage, had torn at the shoulder. A thin line of blood traced down her arm where Jacob's belt buckle had caught skin. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the town was awake. They always woke early for a spectacle. Lydia kept her eyes down, watching her own feet stumble forward, counting steps because it was the only thing left she could control. 17. 18, 19. Her dark hair, usually pinned tight in the way Jacob demanded, hung loose and wild around her face. Dust clung to the tears on her cheeks, making streaks of mud that she couldn't wipe away. "Make way!" Jacob's voice boomed across the square, thick with righteousness and rage. "Make way for the barren woman, the wife who shames her husband, the vessel too broken to carry life." Lydia's stomach turned, not from hunger. She hadn't eaten since yesterday, but from the weight of those words. Barren, broken, shame. She'd heard them so many times they'd started to feel true. The crowd gathered on both sides of the street. Shopkeepers stood in doorways. Women clutched shawls tight around their shoulders and whispered behind their hands. Men removed their hats, not out of respect for Lydia, but out of deference to the ritual they were witnessing. The public breaking of a woman who'd failed her purpose. Mrs. Calloway, the seamstress, looked away when Lydia's gaze accidentally met hers. Margaret Dunn, who'd once borrowed flour from Lydia during a hard winter, suddenly became very interested in the ground. Even young Sarah Prentice, barely 16 and newly married herself, watched with wide, terrified eyes, learning the lesson Dry Hollow taught all its women. This is what happens when you fail. Jacob yanked the rope harder. Lydia stumbled, went down on one knee. Pain shot through her kneecap as it cracked against a stone embedded in the dirt. She gasped, tried to rise, but Jacob didn't stop. He kept walking, dragging her forward until she had no choice but to scramble back to her feet or be pulled face first through the street. 3 years, Jacob announced to the crowd, spinning to face them while still gripping the rope. His face was red, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. 3 years of marriage, and my seed finds no purchase. 3 years of a wife who takes but does not give. Who eats my food, sleeps in my bed, and produces nothing but disappointment. Someone in the crowd murmured agreement. Lydia couldn't see who. Jacob turned back to her, eyes blazing with something that went beyond anger into territory she'd learned to fear. "You've made me a mockery, Lydia. Every man in this town looks at me and sees failure. Because of you. Because you're defective." Lydia's throat constricted. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to scream the truth that Jacob would never allow her to voice, but fear locked the words behind her teeth. In Dry Hollow, a woman's voice was the first thing they took from you. The second was your dignity. The third was hope. She'd already lost the first two. Jacob dragged her toward the center of the square, where the town's whipping post stood next to the horse trough, a grim reminder of frontier justice and the thin line between civilization and savagery. The post had been used for thieves, for drunks who disturbed the peace, for men who needed correction. Never, in Lydia's memory, had it been used for a woman. Until now. 3 years, Jacob repeated, his voice dropping to something quieter but infinitely more dangerous. He pulled her close, so close she could smell the whiskey on his breath from last night's drinking. 3 years of prayers and patience, of giving you everything a woman could want, and you repay me with emptiness. Jacob, please! The words escaped before Lydia could stop them, small and broken. His hand shot out, gripping her jaw hard enough to bruise. You don't speak. Not here. Not now. You've said enough lies in the privacy of our home. Next month, Jacob. Be patient, Jacob. Perhaps this time, Jacob. He shoved her away, and she staggered backward, only staying upright because of the rope still binding her wrists. The crowd had grown. Lydia could see nearly the whole town now, men, women, children, the butcher, the banker, the schoolteacher who'd once told Lydia she had a sharp mind, back before sharp minds became dangerous in a woman. And there, at the back of the crowd, standing in the shadow of the general store, was Reverend Michaels. His face was carefully neutral, his hands folded in front of him. He said nothing, did nothing. His silence was its own sermon. This is acceptable. This is justified. This is the way things are. Jacob tied the rope to the whipping post, pulling it tight so Lydia was forced to stand close to the weathered wood. Her wrists were still bound behind her back, her arms aching from the unnatural position. He walked around her slowly, like a buyer inspecting livestock at auction. I could divorce you, he said conversationally, though his voice was pitched to carry across the square. Send you back to wherever you came from with nothing but the dress on your back. That's my right as a husband, my right under law and custom. Lydia's breath came shallow and fast. The dress on her back was already torn, already ruined. She'd come from St. Louis 3 years ago, answering an advertisement for a bride in a newspaper that had made Dry Hollow sound like a land of opportunity. Hardworking man seeks wife for frontier life. Must be of good moral character and strong constitution. She'd been 21, alone after her parents died, desperate for somewhere to belong. She'd had no idea that strong constitution meant able to endure whatever cruelty came next. But divorce is too kind, Jacob continued. He stopped in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Too easy. You need to understand the weight of your failure. The whole town needs to see what happens when a woman takes vows she can't keep. I tried. Lydia's voice cracked. I tried everything. Not hard enough. Jacob's shout made several people in the crowd flinch. A real woman would have given me sons by now. A real woman would have... That's enough. The voice came from the edge of the crowd, quiet but carrying an authority that made Jacob's tirade falter mid-sentence. Lydia's eyes jerked toward the sound, and she saw him for the first time. A stranger. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a face weathered by sun and wind. He wore buckskin and leather, not the wool suits of Dry Hollow's men. A rifle was slung across his back. A knife hung at his belt. His eyes, sharp and gray as a winter storm, were fixed on Jacob with an intensity that made the air feel suddenly thinner. He didn't belong here. Everything about him, from the way he stood to the way he looked at the scene before him, spoke of mountains and wilderness and a life lived far from the suffocating rules of towns like Dry Hollow. Jacob's face flushed darker. This is none of your concern, stranger. I'm making it my concern. The man stepped forward, and the crowd parted around him like water around stone. Several people whispered, but no one stopped him. Cut her loose. Jacob laughed, but there was an edge of uncertainty in it. This is my wife, my business. You've got no right. I've got every right to stop a man from treating a woman like an animal. The stranger's hand moved to his knife, casual but unmistakable. You want to air your grievances? Do it with words. But you put hands on her again, rope her up again, drag her through the dirt again. We're going to have a different kind of conversation. The square went silent. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't know this man, didn't know why he was risking himself for her. In Dry Hollow, you didn't interfere in a man's marriage. You didn't question his authority over his household. You certainly didn't threaten him in front of the whole town. But this stranger was doing all three. Jacob's hand moved toward his own belt, where Lydia knew he kept a pistol. You're new here, so I'll explain how things work. This woman is my property by law, by marriage contract. What I do with my own property is, she's not property. The stranger's voice went colder. She's a person. and you're about 5 seconds from learning the difference between lawful authority and common decency. Who the hell are you? Jacob demanded. Gideon Rourke.
Our name
And perhaps the stranger, Gideon, said it like it should mean something, like his name alone carried weight. I've been tracking through these mountains for 15 years, and I've seen a lot of ugly things. But watching a man humiliate his wife in the middle of town for something that's likely his own failing, he shook his head. That's a new low. Lydia's eyes widened. His own failing. No one had ever suggested that. In 3 years of marriage, through dozens of whispered conversations with midwives and prayers with women who claimed to know remedies, not once had anyone implied that Jacob might be the reason their marriage produced no children. It was always the woman's fault. Always. Jacob's face went from red to purple. You son of a... Save it. Gideon pulled his knife, the blade catching the early morning light. I'm cutting her loose. You can accept that peaceful, or you can make it difficult. Your choice. For a long moment, the whole world seemed to balance on the edge of that decision. Lydia could feel the tension radiating from Jacob's body, could see his hand still hovering near his pistol. The crowd watched, hungry for violence but uncertain who they should support, the husband exercising his rights, or the stranger defending a principle most of them had forgotten existed. Then Reverend Michaels finally spoke. Jacob, perhaps we should stay out of this. Jacob spun toward the Reverend, fury redirected. All of you stayed silent while I suffered the shame of this woman's barrenness. You let me carry that burden alone, and now you want to lecture me about restraint? I'm not lecturing you about restraint, Gideon said, moving closer. I'm telling you to let her go. Jacob turned back to him, and something shifted in his expression. The rage was still there, but underneath it now was calculation, cold and cruel. You want her? Fine, take her. He pulled out his pistol, not pointing it at Gideon, but holding it loose and ready. But know this, stranger, you're making yourself an enemy of this town, of me. And I don't forget. I'll manage. Gideon moved past Jacob to where Lydia stood bound to the post. His eyes met hers for the first time, and she saw something there she hadn't seen in years. Recognition. Not of her specifically, but of her suffering. Like he knew what it meant to be broken by the world. This is going to hurt, he said quietly, just for her. The circulation's been cut off. When I free your wrists, your arms are going to scream. But I need you to stay standing. Can you do that? Lydia nodded, not trusting her voice. Gideon moved behind her. She felt the knife blade slide between her wrists, cold metal against warm skin. Then a quick, sharp motion, and the rope fell away. The pain was immediate and excruciating. Her arms, forced behind her back for so long, couldn't move at first. Then the blood rushed back into her hands, and she gasped, biting down hard on her lip to keep from crying out. Her shoulders burned. Her wrists throbbed where the rope had cut into flesh. But she stayed standing. Gideon came back around to face her, blocking her view of Jacob and the crowd. Can you walk? I think so. Then we're leaving. Now. He didn't touch her, didn't grab her hand or throw her over his shoulder. He just turned and started walking toward the edge of town, trusting that she would follow. And after 3 years of being dragged, commanded, and controlled, that simple act of trust nearly broke her. Lydia took one shaking step forward, then another. Her feet, torn and bleeding, carried her away from the whipping post, away from Jacob, away from the crowd that had gathered to watch her destruction. This isn't over! Jacob's voice rang out behind them, raw with humiliation and rage. You can't just take another man's wife. I'll have the law on you. The law? Gideon didn't even turn around. You tied up a woman and dragged her through town like a dog. If you want to talk about law, we can do that. But I don't think you'll like how that conversation ends. Someone in the crowd laughed, a quick, nervous sound that was immediately stifled. But Lydia heard it, heard the crack in Dry Hollow's unified front, saw the way some of the women looked at each other with something that might have been recognition, or shame, or the faintest spark of anger at the system that kept them all in line. Jacob made a sound between a growl and a shout, but he didn't follow, didn't raise his pistol, because even through his rage, he understood what Gideon was. Not just a man, but something forged by harder circumstances than a frontier town could produce. A survivor, a fighter, someone who'd learned to back up his words with action. Lydia kept walking, past the general store, past the livery, past the last buildings of Dry Hollow, until there was nothing but open land stretching toward the mountains in the distance. Her legs trembled, her vision blurred with tears she'd been holding back for hours, maybe years. But she didn't stop, didn't look back. "How far can you make it?" Gideon asked when they were clear of town, his pace matching hers. "I don't know," Lydia admitted. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thin and fragile. "Where are we going?" "Away from here." Gideon scanned the horizon, then gestured toward a line of trees maybe half a mile distant. "There's a creek past those cottonwoods. We'll rest there, tend your feet, figure out next steps." "Why?" The question burst out of her before she could stop it. "Why would you do this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Gideon was quiet for a moment, his jaw tight. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "Because I know what it's like to be at someone else's mercy. And I made myself a promise a long time ago that I wouldn't stand by and watch it happen to someone else. Not if I could stop it." They walked in silence after that, Lydia focusing all her energy on putting one foot in front of the other despite the pain. The sun rose higher, turning the sky from gray to pale blue. Behind them, Dry Hollow sat quiet and watchful, a town nursing its wounded pride. When they reached the trees, Lydia's knees finally gave out. She sank to the ground near the creek, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and shock and relief so profound it felt like drowning. Gideon knelt beside her, his movements careful and deliberate. "I'm going to check your wrists and feet, that all right?" She nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. He examined her wrists first, his touch surprisingly gentle for such large, weathered hands. The rope had cut deep in places, leaving raw, angry marks that wept clear fluid and blood. He made a sound of disgust deep in his throat. "Son of a bitch didn't even care if he scarred you permanent." "It doesn't matter," Lydia whispered. "Scars aren't... I'm already..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't articulate the truth that she'd already been ruined in every way that mattered to people like Jacob and the citizens of Dry Hollow. "It matters," Gideon said firmly. He pulled a canteen from his pack and wet a cloth, then began cleaning the wounds with steady, practiced motions. "Every hurt matters. Every scar tells a story, and you get to decide what your story means, not him." Lydia watched him work, this stranger who'd upended her entire life in the space of 10 minutes. His face was hard-lined, with small scars of his own marking his jaw and forehead, evidence of fights or accidents or the general brutality of survival. His hair needed cutting. His clothes were worn but well-maintained, practical rather than fashionable. He looked like a man who'd spent more time alone than in company. "What did you mean?" she asked quietly. "When you said it might be his failing?" Gideon's hands paused for just a moment before continuing their work. "I've known plenty of couples who couldn't have children. More often than not, when folks finally figure out why, it's the man who's the problem. But it's always easier to blame the woman, especially in places like this, where a man's pride is more important than the truth." "How do you know?" "I spent time with a doctor once, army surgeon who ended up in the mountains after the war. He'd seen things, knew things most folks never learn. We'd sit around the fire, and he'd tell stories about medicine, about bodies, about all the ways people get things wrong." Gideon finished with her wrists and moved to her feet, wincing at the damage. "These are going to need proper cleaning. You've got dirt ground deep." "I don't..." Lydia's voice broke. "I don't have anything to pay you with. No money. Nothing of value. If you're expecting..." "I'm not expecting anything." Gideon's eyes met hers, steady and clear. "You don't owe me. Not money, not gratitude, not anything else. I did what needed doing because it was right. That's all." Lydia stared at him, trying to understand this man who spoke of right and wrong like they were simple, straightforward things instead of the complicated, painful truths she'd learned them to be. In Dry Hollow, right meant obedience. Wrong meant resistance. There was no space for anything more nuanced, but Gideon seemed to exist in that space naturally. "He'll come after us," she said. "Jacob, he won't let this go. His pride..." "Let him come." Gideon's voice was flat, final. "I've dealt with prideful men before. They're usually more bark than bite once you strip away the audience. You don't know him." "I know his type." Gideon started cleaning her feet, his touch careful around the worst cuts. "Men who need to make others small so they can feel big, who use their fists or their power because they've got nothing else that makes them worth respecting. Yeah, I know him just fine. Lydia closed her eyes, letting the morning sun warm her face. For the first time in 3 years, no one was controlling her movements. No one was dictating her schedule, her words, her thoughts. She was sitting by a creek with torn feet and wounded wrists, her future utterly uncertain. And somehow, that felt more like freedom than anything she'd known since arriving in Dry Hollow. "What happens now?" she asked. Gideon sat back on his heels, considering. "That depends on what you want. I can take you to the next town over, Silver Ridge, about 2 days' ride from here. Help you get settled somewhere safe. Or if you've got family elsewhere, I can get you to a stage line." "I don't have family or money for a stage." Lydia opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "I have nothing." "That's not true." Gideon gestured around them, at the creek, the trees, the vast open land stretching toward the mountains. "You've got freedom. That's worth more than most people realize." "Freedom to starve? To freeze when winter comes?" Lydia heard the bitterness in her own voice, but couldn't suppress it. "I'm a woman alone, Gideon. You know what happens to women like me." "You're not alone." He said it simply, like stating a fact. "Not right now, anyway. And if you're willing to learn, I can teach you enough to survive out here. How to find food, make shelter, move through country without being seen. Skills that'll serve you no matter where you end up." Lydia searched his face for signs of deception or ulterior motive, but found only honest intention. "Why would you do that?" "Because I can. Because you deserve better than what you got. Because—" He paused, jaw working like he was chewing on words he wasn't sure he should say. "Because maybe helping you is how I make up for times I didn't help when I should have." There was a story there, buried deep. Lydia could feel its weight in the silence that followed. But she didn't push. She understood about painful pasts and things better left unspoken. Instead, she asked, "What do we do first?" Gideon's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "First, we let you heal. Get some food in you, clean water, rest. Then we figure out if you want to keep moving or find somewhere to settle, one step at a time. And if Jacob comes looking, then we'll deal with it." Gideon stood, offering his hand to help her up. "But right now, let's focus on keeping you alive and healing. Everything else can wait." Lydia took his hand, feeling calluses rough against her palm as he pulled her gently to her feet. Her body protested, every muscle aching, but she stayed upright, stayed standing. They moved deeper into the trees, away from open sight. Gideon made camp with efficient, practiced movements. A small fire, well shielded. A bedroll laid out for her. Water boiling for coffee and to sterilize bandages torn from his spare shirt. Lydia watched him work. This mountain man who'd appeared like something from a story just when she needed him most. She didn't fully trust it yet. Didn't fully believe that someone could offer help without expecting something terrible in return. 3 years with Jacob had beaten that optimism out of her. But as Gideon handed her coffee in a tin cup and settled on the opposite side of the fire, maintaining respectful distance, she felt something crack in the armor she'd built around her heart. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But possibility. The faint, trembling possibility that maybe, the world contained more than cruelty and survival. That maybe there were still people who did the right thing simply because it was right. And maybe, just maybe, she could learn to be one of them. The sun climbed higher. The creek burbled over stones. And Lydia Vale, for the first time in 3 years, let herself breathe without counting the cost. The coffee was bitter and strong, and Lydia wrapped both hands around the tin cup like it might disappear if she loosened her grip. Steam rose in thin wisps, carrying the scent of something familiar, normalcy, routine, the simple ritual of a morning that didn't begin with fear. Across the fire, Gideon poured himself a second cup and settled back against a fallen log, his rifle within easy reach but not held. Always within reach, Lydia had noticed. Always ready. "How long have you been in the mountains?" she asked, needing words to fill the strange space between them. Not quite comfortable, not quite tense, something undefined. 15 years, give or take. Gideon stared into his coffee like he could read something there. Came out after the war. Couldn't stomach towns anymore. Too many rules, too many people pretending the ugliness didn't happen. Which side did you fight for? His jaw tightened. The losing one. Not that it matters now. Both sides did things that'll stain their souls forever. He took a long drink. You run far enough into the wilderness, you find out that humans are capable of terrible things, no matter what flag they're carrying. Lydia shifted on the bedroll, her feet still throbbing despite Gideon's careful bandaging. Is that why you stayed out here? To get away from people? Partly. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing upward. Mostly I stayed because I'm better at surviving than living. Out here it's simple. Find food, find water, find shelter. Keep moving. There's no pretense, no performance, just existence. That sounds lonely. It is. Gideon's eyes met hers, and she saw the weight of those 15 years in them. The accumulated silence, the conversations had only with himself, the slow erosion of social grace that came from too much solitude. But lonely's safer than the alternative sometimes. Lydia understood that bone deep. She'd been surrounded by people in Dry Hollow, an entire town of witnesses to her life, and had never felt more alone. Loneliness wasn't about physical proximity. It was about the distance between who you were and who people allowed you to be. What about you? Gideon asked. How'd you end up married to a bastard like Jacob Vale? The question should have felt intrusive, but his tone held only curiosity, not judgment. Lydia found herself answering. I was stupid, young and stupid and desperate for somewhere to belong. She stared into her coffee, watching her reflection ripple on the dark surface. My parents died within 6 months of each other. Consumption. I was working in a boarding house in St. Louis, barely making enough to eat. Then I saw the advertisement. Hardworking man seeks wife for frontier life. It sounded like an adventure, like a fresh start. And I learned that hardworking meant cruel, frontier life meant isolation, and wife meant property. The words came out flat, drained of emotion. Jacob met me at the stage stop with flowers and promises. Told me how beautiful I was, how lucky he felt. Within a week of marriage, the flowers died, and so did the pretense. Gideon's expression darkened. He hurt you before today. It wasn't a question, but Lydia answered anyway. Not at first. At first he was just cold, distant, like he'd gotten what he wanted and the effort of kindness wasn't worth maintaining. She touched her wrist unconsciously, feeling the bandages. The violence started about a year in, when I didn't get pregnant. Small things at first, grabbing too hard, pushing me when he was angry. Then it escalated. Did you try to leave? Where would I go? Lydia's laugh was bitter. I had no money, no family, no friends. The women in town knew what was happening. They had to know, but no one said anything. Because that's how it works in places like Dry Hollow. You keep your head down, accept your lot, and pray you don't make it worse. Gideon was quiet for a long moment, his knuckles white around the cup. I'm sorry that you had to endure that no one stepped in sooner. You stepped in. 3 years too late. Better late than never. Lydia set down her cup, suddenly exhausted despite having barely moved all morning. What happens when he comes looking? And he will come looking. Jacob doesn't forgive humiliation. Let me worry about Jacob. Gideon stood, scanning the tree line with practiced wariness. Right now you need rest. Real rest, without watching over your shoulder. I'll keep watch. You can't stay awake forever. I can stay awake long enough. He moved to the edge of their small camp, positioning himself where he had clear sight lines in multiple directions. Sleep, Lydia. That's an order. She wanted to argue, but exhaustion was already pulling at her like a riptide. Her body, pushed past its limits and finally given permission to stop, simply shut down. She lay back on the bedroll, feeling the morning sun filter through the cottonwood leaves above, and let herself drift. For the first time in 3 years, she slept without nightmares. When Lydia woke, the sun had moved considerably. Midday, maybe early afternoon. Her body ached in new and different ways, the kind of pain that came from healing rather than injury. Gideon sat in the same position, though he'd shifted slightly to stay in the shade. His eyes were alert despite the hours that had passed. You should have woken me, she said, pushing herself upright. You need sleep too. I'll sleep tonight. You needed it more. He handed her a piece of dried meat and some kind of root vegetable she didn't recognize. Eat. We need to talk about what comes next. Lydia took the food, her stomach growling despite her anxiety. You said you could take me to Silver Ridge. I could, but I've been thinking. Gideon leaned forward, his expression serious. Silver Ridge is only 2 days from here. If Jacob's as stubborn as you say, he'll check there first. And while I doubt he'll make a big scene, not after what happened in Dry Hollow, he could make things difficult for you. Spread rumors, poison the well before you even arrive. So what do you suggest? We go deeper into the mountains. There's a valley about a week's travel from here near the Wyoming-Montana border. Beautiful country, sheltered, good water, plenty of game. A few trappers pass through, but mostly it's empty. We could winter there if needed. Lydia's heart hammered. A week into the wilderness with a man she barely knew. Every instinct Jacob had beaten into her screamed danger, warned her that trusting any man led to pain. But those same instincts had also told her to stay quiet, stay small, accept her fate. And where had that gotten her? If we go deeper into the mountains, she said slowly, what happens to me? I don't know how to survive out there. I'd be completely dependent on you. That's why I teach you. Gideon's voice was firm. Starting today. By the time we reach that valley, you'll know enough to survive on your own if you need to. How to set snares, identify edible plants, build shelter, start fire without matches. Basic skills, but enough. Why would you do all that? Because dependence makes you vulnerable, and I don't want you vulnerable ever again. He stood, offering his hand. Come on, lesson 1 starts now. Lydia took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. Her legs were steadier than they'd been that morning, though her feet still protested when she put weight on them. Gideon noticed and frowned. We'll keep it light today. Just observation and knowledge. Save the heavy work for when you're healed. He led her toward the creek. First lesson, water. Out here, water's everything. You can survive weeks without food, but only days without water. So you need to know how to find it and make sure it's safe. He knelt by the creek, gesturing for her to join him. Fast-moving water like this is usually good. The movement keeps it cleaner than standing water, but you still want to look for signs. He pointed upstream. See any dead animals? Any unusual color or smell? Anything that suggests contamination? Lydia scanned the creek carefully. No. It looks clear. Good. Now taste it. He cupped his hands, bringing water to his mouth. Just a small amount. Let it sit on your tongue for a moment. You're checking for any metallic taste, any bitterness that might indicate minerals or poison. She mimicked his actions, the water cold and clean against her lips. It tastes fine. Then it's safe. But remember, in the mountains, streams can change character quickly. Heavy rain upstream can bring runoff that'll make you sick. Always check before drinking, even from sources you've used before. They spent the next hour at the creek, Gideon showing her how to read the landscape for water sources, the types of vegetation that indicated underground springs, the flight patterns of birds at dawn and dusk that pointed toward water holes, the way certain rock formations collected and channeled rainfall. Lydia absorbed it all, her mind hungry for knowledge after years of being told she didn't need to think, only obey. It felt strange and wonderful to learn something practical, something that could keep her alive rather than just make her more acceptable to a husband's demands. You're a quick study, Gideon observed as they walked back toward camp. You ask good questions. Jacob hated questions, said they were proof I didn't trust his leadership. Lydia laughed, the sound surprising her. I learned to keep them to myself. Questions are how you survive. Never apologize for wanting to understand the world around you. Gideon's voice held an edge of anger, not at her, but at the system that had tried to dull her mind. Out here, curiosity keeps you alive. Complacency gets you killed. They reached camp to find it exactly as they'd left it, fire still smoldering, bedroll undisturbed. But Gideon tensed immediately, his hand moving to his rifle. What is it? Lydia whispered. Tracks. Fresh. He pointed to a spot just beyond the fire circle where the dirt showed clear boot prints. Someone was here while we were at the creek. Fear flooded through Lydia, cold and familiar. Jacob? Don't know yet. Gideon circled the camp slowly, reading the story written in disturbed earth and broken twigs. Single person, adult male based on the stride length and depth. Came from the east, stood here watching for a few minutes, then left heading south. Why didn't he confront us? Maybe he wasn't ready for a fight. Maybe he was just gathering information. Gideon's jaw was tight. Either way, we're not safe here anymore. We need to move. They broke camp quickly, Gideon moving with efficiency born from years of practice. He buried the fire, scattered the ashes, swept away obvious signs of their presence. Within 20 minutes, there was little evidence they'd been there at all. "Can you ride?" he asked, leading her to where a horse was hidden deeper in the trees, a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes. "I can manage." "Good. We'll double up until we're clear of this area, then I'll set you up with proper gear." He swung into the saddle and extended a hand. "Come on." Lydia took his hand and let him pull her up behind him. The position forced intimacy, her arms around his waist, her chest against his back, but Gideon's body language remained respectful, professional. He didn't pull her closer than necessary, didn't make comments or jokes. He simply rode. They traveled through the afternoon, moving steadily northwest into rougher terrain. Gideon chose paths that provided cover, avoiding open ground where they'd be visible from a distance. He explained his choices as they rode, turning the journey into another lesson. "See those aspens?" He pointed to a grove of white-barked trees. "Their leaves shake in the slightest breeze. If you're trying to move unseen, avoid them. The motion draws the eye. But if you need to know someone's coming, watch the aspens. They'll show movement before you hear it." Lydia filed it away, adding it to the growing catalog of survival knowledge. "How did you learn all this?" "Trial and error. Books. When I could find them. And from people who knew more than me, trappers, hunters, a Shoshone woman who probably saved my life my first winter out here." His voice softened at the memory. "She taught me how to read weather, track game, survive when everything's trying to kill you. I owe her more than I could ever repay." "What happened to her?" "She went back to her people. I kept moving. That's how it works out here. People cross paths, share what they know, then go their separate ways. Nothing permanent, nothing that ties you down." Lydia heard the loneliness beneath his words again, the careful way he'd structured his life to avoid connection. "Is that what you want? To keep moving forever?" Gideon was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I don't know anymore. Used to be clear, stay moving, stay alone, stay safe. But lately," he trailed off. "But lately I've been wondering if safety's the same as living, or if I've just been surviving so long I forgot the difference." Before Lydia could respond, Gideon reined in the horse sharply. His entire body went rigid. "What?" "Quiet." His voice was barely a whisper. "Listen." Lydia strained her ears. At first she heard nothing but wind through pines and the distant call of a hawk. Then, there, the unmistakable sound of voices, male voices, rough and carrying. "How many?" she breathed. "At least 3. Maybe more." Gideon guided the horse behind a thick stand of evergreens, dismounting silently. "Stay here. Don't make a sound." He moved through the trees like smoke, utterly silent despite his size. Lydia watched him disappear into the shadows, her heart pounding so hard she was certain it could be heard for miles. Minutes crawled past. The voices grew louder, then faded. Lydia heard the crack of breaking branches, the jingle of harness and bit. Riders moving through the forest nearby. Then Gideon was back, his face grim. "It's a search party. 5 men from Dry Hollow. Jacob's leading them." The fear that had been simmering in Lydia's gut turned to ice. "What do we do?" "We stay ahead of them." Gideon remounted, pulling her up behind him again. "They're moving slow, checking every creek and canyon, but they're on our trail. Won't take them long to find where we camped." "Maybe I should go back." The words tumbled out before Lydia could stop them. "Maybe if I just—" "No." Gideon's voice was iron. "That's your fear talking, not your sense. You go back, Jacob won't just punish you. He'll destroy you, and he'll do it publicly, to make an example." "But you didn't sign up for this. For being hunted." "I signed up the minute I cut that rope." Gideon urged the horse forward, moving faster now. "And I don't abandon people. Not ever again." There was a story there too, another piece of the past that shaped him. But there was no time to ask. They rode hard, pushing through terrain that grew increasingly difficult. Steep slopes, narrow passages between rocks. areas where the horse had to pick its way carefully to avoid injury. As evening approached, they climbed higher into the mountains. The air grew colder, thinner. Lydia's chest ached with each breath, her arms tight around Gideon's waist to keep from sliding off as the horse navigated treacherous ground. Finally, as the sun touched the western peaks, Gideon guided them into a narrow canyon that looked like a crack in the mountain itself. The walls rose high on either side, blocking out most of the light. But deep in the canyon, there was a small sheltered area with an overhang that provided protection from above. "We'll stop here for the night," Gideon said, helping Lydia down. "It's defensible, hidden, and there's no easy way to approach without making noise." Lydia's legs nearly gave out when her feet touched ground. Every muscle screamed from the long ride, her injuries from the morning protesting the additional abuse. Gideon caught her elbow, steadying her. "I know you're hurting, but we can't risk a fire tonight. Too visible." He guided her to the overhang and pulled out a heavy blanket from his pack. "We'll share body heat to stay warm, that's all. Just warmth. Understood?" Lydia nodded, too exhausted to feel anything but gratitude. Gideon settled them under the overhang, the blanket wrapped around both of them, his back to the canyon wall so he could watch the entrance. He positioned himself carefully, maintaining space between them despite the shared covering. "Try to sleep," he said quietly. "I'll keep watch." "You said you'd sleep tonight." "Plans change." His eyes never left the canyon entrance. "Jacob's closer than I'd like. We need to be ready to move at first light." Lydia wanted to argue, to insist he rest, but her body betrayed her. Within minutes, despite the cold and fear and uncertainty, she drifted into fitful sleep. She woke to voices. Gideon's hand was over her mouth before she could make a sound, his eyes urgent in the pre-dawn darkness. She nodded understanding, and he slowly removed his hand. The voices were distant but unmistakable. Jacob's drawl carried through the canyon, bouncing off stone walls. "Can't have gone far. Not with her feet torn up like they were. Probably holed up somewhere close." Another voice responded, too low for Lydia to make out words. Then Jacob again. "I don't care if he's armed. There's 5 of us and 1 of him. When we find them, we take him down and bring her back. Simple as that." Gideon's jaw was tight, his hand on his rifle. He leaned close to Lydia's ear, his whisper barely audible. "They're at the canyon entrance. If they come in, stay behind me. No matter what happens, stay behind me." Lydia's throat constricted. She wanted to tell him to run, to save himself, that she wasn't worth this. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down, in a part of her that Jacob had tried to kill but failed, she wanted to live, wanted to be free, wanted to matter enough that someone would fight for her. The voices grew closer. Lydia could hear the crunch of boots on stone, the metallic clink of weapons being readied. 5 men against 1, and she was useless, no weapon, barely able to walk, a liability Gideon didn't need. Then a new sound cut through the dawn, the scream of a mountain lion, close and territorial and absolutely terrifying. The voices stopped. "The hell was that?" one of the men asked, his voice tight with fear. "Mountain cat," someone else replied. "Big one from the sound of it." Jacob's voice angry now. "So what? We're armed. We can handle—" The scream came again, closer this time. Then another answering call from a different direction. 2 cats, maybe more, communicating across the canyon. "I ain't dying for your pride, Jacob," one of the men said. "That's cougar territory, and they sound hungry. We should head back, wait for better light." "We're not leaving." Jacob sounded desperate now, his authority fraying. "They're right here, I know it." "Then you stay and look," another voice shot back. "I'm not getting mauled because you can't control your wife." The argument continued, voices rising and falling. Then, slowly, the sound of retreat, boots moving away from the canyon entrance, heading back the way they'd come. Not all of them, Lydia realized. One set of footsteps remained, stubborn and angry. Jacob. Gideon's grip on his rifle tightened. They waited, barely breathing, as Jacob paced at the canyon entrance. Lydia could picture him, jaw clenched, fists tight, pride and rage warring with common sense. Another mountain lion scream echoed through the canyon, so close it seemed to vibrate in Lydia's chest. Finally, Jacob cursed, a long, vicious string of words, and his footsteps retreated, following his men. They waited another hour, silent and still, before Gideon finally relaxed. "They're gone. For now." The That was lucky, Lydia whispered. The mountain lion showing up right when... She stopped as she saw Gideon's expression. Not relief, but something that looked almost like guilt. That wasn't luck, she said slowly. Was it? Gideon pulled something from his pack, a carved wooden tube about 6 inches long. Cougar call, used for hunting, or in this case for making men too scared to check dark canyons at dawn. Lydia stared at him, then started to laugh. It bubbled up from somewhere deep, part relief and part amazement at the sheer audacity of it. You faked mountain lion attacks? I improvised. There's a difference. But there was the ghost of a smile on his face. Come on, we need to use this head start. They'll figure out the trick eventually. They packed quickly and mounted up, riding out of the canyon as the sun finally broke over the eastern peaks. Gideon set a punishing pace, pushing the horse hard through terrain that grew increasingly wild and beautiful. Towering pines, crystal streams, meadows thick with late summer wildflowers. By midday, they'd put significant distance between themselves and Dry Hollow's search party. Gideon finally allowed them to stop near a high mountain lake, the water so clear Lydia could see the bottom 30 feet down. We'll rest here for a few hours, he said, helping her down. Let the horse recover and put together a plan. Lydia's entire body ached, but there was something else there too, a strange kind of exhilaration. She'd spent the last day running for her life, hunted by her husband and his men, sleeping rough in the wilderness. By all rights, she should be terrified, broken, ready to give up. Instead, she felt more alive than she had in years. Teach me something else, she said to Gideon as they settled by the lake. Something useful. He studied her face, seeing something there that made him nod slowly. All right. Lesson 2. How to hide your trail. They spent the afternoon by the lake, Gideon showing her techniques that seemed to come from another era entirely. How to walk without leaving clear prints, how to use water to break up a trail, how to lay false signs that would send pursuers in the wrong direction. He taught her to read the forest like a language, to see the stories written in broken branches and disturbed earth. You've got good instincts, he said as the sun began its descent. Better than most people I've taught. You pay attention to details. Jacob hated that about me. Said I noticed too much, questioned too much. Lydia watched the lake's surface, mirror smooth in the still air. I learned to pretend I didn't see things, but I always saw them. Then use that now. See everything. Question everything. Trust your instincts, because out here, they're what keep you breathing. As evening fell, they made another cold camp. No fire, just dried meat and water. Gideon kept watch while Lydia tried to rest, but sleep was elusive. Her mind kept circling back to Jacob's voice in the canyon, the desperation in his tone, the knowledge that he wouldn't stop hunting her until he dragged her back or destroyed her completely. What are you thinking about? Gideon asked quietly. Whether running is enough. Whether we can actually stay ahead of him. We can, but it'll take work, patience, and you need to decide something. What? Gideon met her eyes across the darkness. Whether you're running from Jacob or running towards something else, because that'll determine everything that comes next. Lydia considered that, turning it over in her mind. Running from Jacob was reactive, defensive, letting him dictate the terms of her life even in his absence. But running towards something, I want to learn, she said finally. Everything you can teach me. I want to be someone who can survive anywhere, who doesn't need to depend on anyone else's mercy or protection. I want to be strong. You're already strong, Gideon said. You survived 3 years of hell and came out still wanting to live. That's the hardest kind of strength there is. Then I want to be a different kind of strong, the kind that fights back. Something shifted in Gideon's expression, approval mixed with concern. Fighting back's dangerous. It means confrontation, not just escape. I know, Lydia's voice was steady, but I'm tired of running, tired of letting fear make my decisions. Jacob taught me to be afraid. You're teaching me to survive. Maybe it's time I taught myself to fight. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. All right, but we do it smart. We build your skills, build your strength, and we don't take him on until you're ready. Agreed? Agreed. They shook on it there in the darkness, two people bound by circumstance and choice, beginning a partnership neither had expected, but both somehow needed. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of motion and learning. Gideon kept them moving through the high country, always staying ahead of any pursuit, always teaching. He showed Lydia how to set snares for rabbits and how to skin them without waste, how to identify which plants were edible and which would make her sick, how to build a fire that gave heat without smoke, and how to read the sky for weather changes that could mean the difference between shelter and exposure. Her hands, soft from 3 years of being Jacob's wife, grew calloused and capable. Her body, weakened by stress and deliberate malnutrition, began to strengthen with regular meals and constant movement. The rope burns on her wrists healed into thin white scars that she touched sometimes at night, reminding herself that she'd survived. But it was the shooting lessons that changed something fundamental in her. "You need to be able to defend yourself," Gideon said one afternoon, pulling out a small pistol he'd been carrying in his pack. "I won't always be around, and you can't rely on me to protect you." Lydia took the weapon, feeling its weight in her palm. "Jacob never let me near his guns, said women couldn't be trusted with them." Jacob was a fool. Gideon positioned himself behind her, adjusting her stance. "Women can shoot as well as men, sometimes better. You've just got to learn how." He taught her to aim, to breathe, to squeeze the trigger rather than pull it. The first shot went wide, the recoil jarring through her arm. The second was closer. By the 10th, she was hitting the target he'd set up, a piece of bark on a distant tree, more often than not. "Good," Gideon said, and the pride in his voice made something warm unfurl in Lydia's chest. "Keep practicing. A gun's only useful if you're willing to use it." "Could I?" Lydia lowered the pistol, staring at it. "If it came down to it, if Jacob came after us, could I actually pull the trigger?" "That's a question only you can answer." Gideon's voice was serious. "And you don't have to answer it now. Just know that having the option is better than not having it." That night, they camped in a sheltered valley that Gideon said was one of his favorite spots, a place where a natural hot spring fed into a pool surrounded by smooth stones. He'd been bringing Lydia here deliberately, she realized. This was the place he'd mentioned that first day, the valley where they could winter if needed. "It's beautiful," she said, watching steam rise from the water in the cooling evening air. "It's safe." Gideon was setting up their camp with his usual efficiency. Remote enough that most people never find it. The trappers who pass through know about it, but they respect it as neutral ground. No trouble allowed here. Lydia looked around at the valley, the ring of mountains protecting it on all sides, the thick forest that would provide game and firewood, the meadow where a small cabin could be built. It felt like a place out of time, untouched by the ugliness of towns like Dry Hollow. "You've thought about staying here," she said, "making it permanent." "I've thought about it." Gideon didn't look at her, focusing intently on lashing together a frame for their shelter. "Never had a good enough reason before. And now? Now I'm thinking maybe it's time to stop running from the past and start building something for the future." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to examine. Lydia turned away, her heart beating too fast, and busied herself with gathering wood for a fire that Gideon said would be safe here. The valley was deep enough that smoke wouldn't be visible from a distance. Later, after they'd eaten and the fire had burned down to coals, Gideon pulled out the leather satchel Lydia had seen him carrying since they'd left Dry Hollow. He'd been careful with it, she'd noticed, protective. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice rough, "about why I intervened that day in the square, about why I know Jacob Vale." Lydia's attention sharpened. She'd sensed there was history there, something personal in the way Gideon had confronted Jacob, but he'd never offered details, and she hadn't pushed. "You don't owe me explanations," she said carefully. "Maybe not, but you deserve to know who you're traveling with, what demons I'm carrying." Gideon opened the satchel and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and creased from years of handling. "This is a letter from a woman named Clara, 6 years old." He handed it to Lydia, and she unfolded it with careful fingers. As she read, the pieces began to fall into place with sickening clarity. Jacob. Dry Hollow. A woman blamed for a man's crime, a cover-up, a life destroyed. "She was my fiancée." Gideon's jaw was tight. "We were supposed to be married in May of 1871. Then Jacob's brother Benjamin decided he wanted her for himself." Lydia read the letter again, slower this time, catching the pain between the lines. The fear. the resignation, the forced acceptance that sometimes the truth didn't matter, that power and influence would always win over justice. "What happened to her?" she asked quietly. "They drove her out of town, put her on a wagon east with nothing but the clothes on her back and $20. Told her if she ever came back, they'd have her arrested." Gideon's hands were fists at his sides. "I wanted to follow her, to fight for her, but she begged me not to. Said Jacob had already threatened to hang me for assault on a councilman's brother if I didn't stay away." "So you came to the mountains?" "I came to the mountains because staying in Dry Hollow would have meant watching Jacob walk around free after what he'd done to Clara, after he'd helped his brother cover up a crime and destroyed an innocent woman's life to protect family reputation." Gideon's voice went cold. "I couldn't stomach it, so I left." Lydia thought about what she'd read in the letter. The casual cruelty, the systematic destruction of a woman's life, the absolute certainty that no one would believe her over two powerful men. It could have been her own story, written 6 years earlier. "Benjamin," she said slowly. "Jacob mentioned him once, said his brother died in an accident. Benjamin went hunting alone in the fall of '72, fell from a cliff near Copper Creek, broke his neck." Gideon's expression was carefully neutral. "They found his body 3 days later." "And you were in these mountains?" "About 5 miles from Copper Creek, yes." Lydia looked at him, this man who'd saved her life, who'd taught her to survive, who carried the weight of his own failed rescue like a stone around his neck. "Did you?" "No." Gideon's voice was firm. "I thought about it, planned it even, but I didn't kill him. Benjamin was drunk and careless. He climbed a cliff face that was unstable even in good conditions. What happened to him was his own doing. But Jacob thinks you did it. Jacob suspects. Can't prove it. I made sure of that. But after Benjamin died, Jacob started telling people he had enemies in the mountains, that there were men out here who held grudges." Gideon's smile was bitter. "I let him worry, figured fear was fair payment for what he did to Clara." Lydia folded the letter carefully and handed it back. "That's why he looked at you like he'd seen a ghost that day in the square. He wasn't expecting me to show up in Dry Hollow again. I haven't been back in near 5 years." Gideon tucked the letter back into the satchel with reverent care. "But I was passing through, needed supplies, and figured enough time had passed that I could slip in and out without trouble. Then I saw what he was doing to you. And you couldn't walk away. I couldn't watch another woman suffer because of that man's cruelty." Gideon's eyes met hers, and the pain there was raw and unguarded. "I failed Clara. I wasn't strong enough or brave enough to stand up to Jacob when it mattered, but I could be strong enough for you." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. "You didn't fail her, Gideon. You were 20 years old and powerless against the whole town. There was nothing you could have done that wouldn't have gotten you killed or thrown in prison. I should have tried anyway. And then you'd both be destroyed instead of just her." Lydia moved closer, putting her hand on his arm. "You survived. That's what mattered to Clara. That's what she wrote in her letter. She wanted you to live free, even if she couldn't be free with you." Gideon was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I tried to find her once, about a year after she left, tracked the wagon company, followed the route east, but the trail went cold in Kansas City. She could be anywhere now. Or she could be living a good life somewhere," Lydia said gently, "far from Dry Hollow and everything it represents. Maybe she found peace." "I hope so." Gideon's hand came up to cover hers where it rested on his arm. "I hope she's happy, safe, everything I couldn't give her." They sat in silence after that, watching the fire burn down to embers. Lydia thought about Clara, this woman she'd never met but felt connected to across time and circumstance. Two women destroyed by the same man, the same system, the same casual cruelty disguised as righteousness. "There's something I need to tell you too," Lydia said finally, "about why we never had children, about what Jacob was really doing to me." Gideon turned to her, his attention sharpening. "He used to make me drink these tonics," Lydia continued, the words coming easier now that she'd started. "The midwife, Mrs. Brennan, she'd prepare them. Jacob said they were fertility treatments, that they'd help me conceive, but they made me so sick. Terrible cramping, bleeding that wasn't natural." "What kind of tonics?" "I don't know exactly, But the third time it happened, I was so ill I couldn't leave bed for a week. And I think, her voice broke, I think I might have been pregnant, and whatever was in those tonics ended it. Gideon's hands clenched into fists. He was poisoning you. He was keeping me barren so he'd have an excuse to punish me, to maintain control. The truth of it, spoken aloud, made Lydia feel sick. All those times he called me defective, said I was broken. He was the one breaking me, deliberately. That bastard. Gideon stood abruptly, pacing the small clearing. He wasn't just cruel, he was calculating. He engineered your failures so he could justify the abuse. I only figured it out after I left, after I'd had time away from him to think clearly. Lydia wrapped her arms around herself. In Dry Hollow, I was so beaten down I couldn't see past his version of reality. But out here, with you teaching me to trust my own observations, it all became clear. Gideon stopped pacing and crouched in front of her, his eyes blazing with fury. If Jacob ever gets his hands on you again, it won't be to drag you back home. It'll be to silence you permanently, because you're the proof of his crimes, the living evidence that he's not the upstanding citizen he pretends to be. Fear curled cold in Lydia's stomach. Then what do I do? Keep running forever? Live in hiding because telling the truth would put a target on my back? No. Gideon's voice was firm. You get strong enough that he can't touch you. You learn enough that you can defend yourself. And when the time comes, if it comes, you face him from a position of strength, not vulnerability. How long will that take? As long as it needs to. Gideon stood, offering his hand to help her up. But you're learning fast, Lydia. Faster than anyone I've taught. Another few weeks and you'll be able to survive out here on your own if you need to. And then what? I just exist? Alone in the wilderness forever? Or you decide what kind of life you want to build? Gideon gestured around at the valley. This place could support a cabin, a garden, maybe even livestock if you worked at it. It's not town living, but it's a life. A real one, on your own terms. Lydia looked around at the valley with new eyes, imagining it. A small cabin near the hot spring, a vegetable garden in the sunny meadow, maybe chickens, a goat for milk, a life built by her own hands, accountable to no one, safe from men like Jacob, who thought ownership was the same as love. What about you? She asked. Would you stay too? Or would you keep moving? Gideon was quiet for a moment, and Lydia saw something vulnerable cross his face. I've been moving for 15 years, running from the past, from connections, from anything that might tie me down or give someone power over me. But lately I've been thinking, maybe I'm tired of running. What changed? You. He said it simply like stating a fact. Watching you learn, watching you get stronger, it made me realize I've been confusing isolation with safety. I've been alone so long I forgot what it felt like to matter to someone, to have someone matter to me. Lydia's heart stuttered. Gideon, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. You've been through hell, and the last thing you need is another man making demands or expectations. But if you decide to stay here, to build something in this valley, I'd like to stay too. Help you build it, as partners, equals. No obligations beyond what we choose. Partners, equals. The words felt foreign after 3 years of marriage to Jacob, where every interaction had been about power and submission, control and compliance. But they also felt right, like something she could build a future on. I need time, Lydia said carefully, to figure out who I am outside of being Jacob's wife, to learn what I want instead of just reacting to what I don't want. Boke, take all the time you need. Gideon's voice was gentle. I'm not going anywhere. They settled down to sleep that night under the stars, the hot spring steaming nearby, the valley wrapped in protective darkness. Lydia lay on her bedroll and thought about choices, the ones she'd made, the ones that had been made for her, and the ones still ahead. For the first time since leaving Dry Hollow, she let herself imagine a future that wasn't defined by survival or fear, a future where she could be strong and safe and maybe, eventually, happy. The mountains rose dark against the star-scattered sky, and Lydia felt something shift in her chest. Not quite hope, but close. The beginning of belief that maybe, just maybe, she deserved the kind of life Gideon was offering to help her build. Freedom, partnership, peace. It seemed almost too good to be true. But then again, So had waking up this morning without rope burns on her wrists, without fear knotting her stomach, without the constant weight of Jacob's expectations crushing her spirit. Maybe impossible things happened more often than she'd been taught to believe. The next morning brought a complication neither of them had anticipated. Lydia was washing at the edge of the hot spring when she heard voices. Not Jacob's search party, but different voices. Younger. She froze, water dripping from her hands, and listened. Told you this valley was here. My uncle comes through every winter, says it's the best spot in the territory. Your uncle also said there'd be nobody here. So who's that horse tied up over by them trees? Gideon appeared beside her silently, rifle in hand but not raised. Trappers, he murmured. Young ones, from the sound of it. Probably harmless, but stay behind me just in case. Two men emerged from the tree line. Boys, really, couldn't be more than 18 or 19. They stopped short when they saw Gideon, hands moving instinctively toward the knives at their belts. Easy, Gideon said, his voice calm and level. Valley's big enough for all of us, no need for trouble. The taller of the two boys relaxed slightly. You're Gideon Rourke. Uncle Pete told me about you. Said you were fair, long as folks didn't cause problems. Your Uncle Pete's got good sense. Gideon lowered his rifle. You boys passing through or planning to camp? Just passing through, heading up to the high country before the first snow. The boy's eyes found Lydia, and she saw curiosity there, but not threat. Didn't know you traveled with a partner now. Recent development, Gideon said shortly. This is Lydia, and she's under my protection, so I'd appreciate you boys keeping respectful distance and moving along when your business here is done. Yes, sir? The shorter boy nudged his companion. We'll just fill our water skins and be on our way. Don't mean to intrude. They did exactly that, keeping their movements slow and visible, clearly not wanting to provoke Gideon into any kind of confrontation. But as they were preparing to leave, the taller boy turned back. Mr. Rourke, there's something you should know. We came through Dry Hollow 3 days ago. There's talk in town about a woman who ran off with a mountain man. Her husband's offering a reward, $50 to anyone who brings back information about where she is. Lydia's blood went cold. Gideon's expression didn't change. That's so? Yes, sir. And some of the men were saying they'd seen signs of travel heading into the high country, boot prints and horse tracks. They were putting together another search party when we left. Appreciate the warning. Gideon's voice was neutral, but Lydia could see the tension in his shoulders. You boys have a safe journey. After they left, Gideon turned to Lydia. We need to move, today. $50 is enough to motivate every trapper and prospector in these mountains, even the ones who might normally mind their own business. Where can we go? Lydia felt panic rising. You said this valley was safe. It was, before Jacob put a price on your head. Gideon was already breaking camp, moving with urgent efficiency. Now it's just a matter of time before someone comes looking. We need to get somewhere even more remote, somewhere most people don't know about. Does such a place exist? Yes, but it's rough country, a week's hard travel, maybe more. And once we're there, we'll be stuck until spring, no way in or out once the snow starts. Gideon paused, looking at her seriously. You'd be completely isolated, just you and me and whatever we can hunt or store before winter. That's a different kind of survival than what I've been teaching you. Well, Lydia thought about the alternative. Being found by bounty hunters, dragged back to Dry Hollow, handed over to Jacob. Whatever he did to her after that humiliation would make the public punishment in the square look merciful. I'll take isolation over Jacob, she said firmly. When do we leave? Within the hour. They packed everything they could carry and set out, leaving the beautiful valley behind. Gideon pushed them hard, moving through terrain that grew progressively more difficult. Steep climbs, narrow ledges, areas where they had to dismount and lead the horse carefully over treacherous ground. Where exactly are we going? Lydia asked on the third day, her muscles screaming from the constant exertion. There's a box canyon about 40 miles north of here. Hidden entrance, sheer walls on 3 sides. The only way in is through a passage so narrow you'd miss it if you didn't know to look. Gideon helped her over a particularly rough section. I found it by accident 5 years ago. Never told anyone about it. Not even the trappers you trade with? Especially not them. Some places need to stay secret. He glanced back at her. How are you holding up? I'm managing. And she was, Lydia realized with some surprise. 3 weeks ago, this pace would have destroyed her. But the constant travel and physical work had built strength she hadn't known she was capable of. Her body was adapting, learning, becoming the kind of hardy that survival demanded. They reached the box canyon on the evening of the 6th day, just as the sun was setting. Gideon led them through the narrow entrance. He was right. It was almost invisible, just a crack in the rock face that widened into a passage barely wide enough for the horse. But on the other side, the canyon opened into something almost magical. A hidden valley, smaller than the one they'd left but perfectly sheltered. A stream ran through it, fed by a waterfall that cascaded down the sheer back wall. The grass was thick and green, pine trees clustered near the walls, providing both lumber and windbreak. "It's perfect," Lydia breathed. "It'll do." But Gideon was smiling, the first real smile she'd seen from him in days. "We've got about 3 weeks before the first serious snow. That gives us time to build a shelter, hunt and preserve meat, gather firewood. It'll be tight, but we can make it work." They set to work immediately. Gideon taught Lydia how to fell trees and strip logs, how to notch them so they'd fit together tight. They built the cabin against one wall of the canyon, using the stone as a natural fourth wall and chimney. It was small, just one room with a sleeping loft, but it was solid and weatherproof. During the days, they worked until exhaustion forced them to stop. During the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked about everything and nothing. Gideon told her stories about his time in the war, about the men he'd served with and lost. Lydia told him about her childhood in St. Louis, about her parents and the life she'd had before they died. It felt like peeling away layers, getting down to the people they'd been before the world had broken them. "You would have liked Clara," Gideon said one night, cleaning his rifle by firelight. "She was smart like you, curious about everything. She used to ask me questions about the natural world that I couldn't answer, then we'd spend hours trying to figure them out together." "What happened after she left?" Lydia asked gently. "Did you ever hear from her again?" "No. The letter you read, that was the only contact we had after they drove her out." Gideon's hand stilled on the rifle. "I used to imagine scenarios where she'd come back, where we'd find each other again. But after a while, I realized I was living in the past, that she'd moved on, built a new life, and I needed to do the same." "But you never did. Move on, I mean." "No." He met her eyes. "I told myself I had, that I was content alone, that I didn't need anyone. But the truth is I was just too afraid to try again, too afraid of losing someone else." Lydia understood that fear bone deep. "And now? Now I'm thinking maybe the risk is worth it." Gideon's voice was quiet. "Maybe loneliness is its own kind of death, just slower than the quick kind." The cabin took shape over the next 2 weeks. They chinked the gaps between logs with moss and mud, built a door from planks they'd split by hand, constructed a sleeping loft that would trap heat from the fire below. It was rough work, exhausting work, but there was satisfaction in it too, in building something with their own hands that would shelter them through the coming winter. During those weeks, something shifted between them. The careful distance Gideon had maintained began to close, not in any dramatic way, but in small moments, hands touching when passing tools, sitting closer by the fire at night, the comfortable silence of people who'd learned to trust each other. Lydia caught herself watching him sometimes, noticing things she'd been too frightened or exhausted to see before. The way his hands moved with such capable precision, the rare smile that softened his weathered face, the gentleness he showed when teaching her, never impatient, never condescending. He was nothing like Jacob, nothing like the man she'd been taught to expect. One evening, as they were finishing the last of the roof repairs before the snow came, Lydia asked the question that had been building in her mind for days. "When spring comes, when we can leave this canyon, what happens then?" Gideon hammered in a final peg before answering. "That depends on what you want." "I don't know what I want." Lydia sat back, frustrated. 3 months ago, I knew exactly what my life was. It was terrible, but it was known. Now everything's uncertain, and I can't. You don't have to decide now. Gideon climbed down from the roof and sat beside her. "We've got all winter to figure it out. But Lydia, whatever you decide, you need to know something." "What?" "Jacob's not going to stop looking for you. Not with the humiliation you caused him in Dry Hollow. Men like him, they can't let go of that kind of slight. It eats at them, becomes an obsession. Gideon's voice was serious. Even if we hide here all winter, come spring he'll still be out there, still hunting. So what are you saying? That I'll never be free of him? I'm saying you've got two choices. You can spend your life running and hiding, always looking over your shoulder, or you can confront the problem directly. Find a way to make it so Jacob can't hurt you anymore. How? He's got the law on his side, the town's support, everything that matters. He's got those things because no one's challenged him on them, because people are afraid or complicit, or they just don't care enough to get involved. Gideon turned to face her fully. But what if someone did challenge him? What if there was proof of what he did to you, real evidence that couldn't be dismissed or covered up? Lydia's heart began to pound. What kind of evidence? Mrs. Brennan's records, for one. If she kept notes on the tonics she prepared, that's documented proof of poisoning. And if we could find Clara, get her to testify about what Jacob did 6 years ago. That establishes a pattern. Shows he's been covering up crimes and destroying women for years. That's insane. We can't just waltz back into Dry Hollow and demand justice. No. But we could go to the territorial marshal, present evidence, force an investigation. Gideon's eyes were bright with possibility. It's risky, but it's also the only way you'll ever truly be free. Lydia stared at him, her mind racing. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. You'd help me do that? Risk yourself again for... I didn't finish it with Clara. I let Jacob win because I was young and scared and powerless. Gideon's voice was fierce. But I'm not that person anymore. And you're not powerless either. Together, maybe we can do what neither of us could do alone. The first snow came that night, soft flakes drifting down through the pines. They watched it from the cabin doorway, the canyon transforming into something pristine and otherworldly. We've got all winter to plan, Gideon said quietly. To get stronger, gather evidence, figure out how to make this work. And when spring comes, we go back. Lydia finished the thought, feeling certainty settle in her chest. We face Jacob, and we make sure he can never hurt anyone again. Gideon smiled and pulled the door closed against the cold. Inside, the fire crackled warm and bright, and for the first time since Lydia could remember, the future felt like something worth fighting for. Winter settled over the canyon like a blanket, deep and silent and absolute. The snow came in waves, sometimes gentle flurries that dusted the pines with white, sometimes blizzards that howled through the narrow entrance and piled drifts halfway up the cabin walls. Lydia and Gideon fell into a rhythm dictated by survival and the slow passage of frozen days. Mornings meant tending the fire, melting snow for water, checking the meat they'd smoked and stored in a cache dug into the frozen ground. Afternoons meant hunting when the weather allowed, or practicing skills inside the cabin when it didn't. Evenings meant sitting by the fire, planning, talking, slowly building the case they'd need against Jacob when spring finally came. Tell me everything you remember about the house, Gideon said one night, a piece of charcoal in his hand and a flat piece of bark serving as paper. Where Jacob kept important documents, where he might have stored evidence. Lydia closed her eyes, forcing herself back into memories she'd rather forget. He had a study on the first floor, locked desk, always kept the key with him. But there was a spare. He didn't know I knew about it. Hidden in a false bottom of the liquor cabinet, Gideon sketched as she talked, creating a rough map of Jacob's house. What kind of documents did he keep? Financial records mostly. Letters from business associates? Legal papers? Lydia paused, remembering something. And a ledger. Brown leather, about this big. He used to write in it late at night when he thought I was asleep. Always locked it back in the desk when he was done. That ledger might be important. If he kept records of payments to Mrs. Brennan or correspondence about Clara. He would have kept them, Lydia said with certainty. Jacob's meticulous, obsessive about documentation. He told me once it was because you never knew when you'd need proof of something, when you'd need leverage. Then that's our first target when we go back. Get into that desk, find the ledger, and any other evidence. Gideon set down the charcoal. But we can't just break in. We need to be smart about timing, about having an exit plan if things go wrong. The first Tuesday of every month, Jacob has a town council meeting, takes him away from home for hours. Lydia's mind was racing now. 3 years of observing her husband's patterns finally put to use against him. That would be our best opportunity. And Mrs. Brennan? Think she'd be willing to testify if we could guarantee her safety? I don't know. Jacob had power over her. He could ruin her business, her reputation. She was terrified of him. Lydia considered it. But she also felt guilty. I could see it sometimes in the way she couldn't quite meet my eyes when she came to deliver the tonics. Maybe guilt would be enough to make her brave. They spent weeks like this, building their plan piece by piece. Gideon taught Lydia how to pick simple locks using tools he fashioned from wire, how to move silently through a house, how to search a room quickly without leaving obvious signs of disturbance. Skills he'd learned during the war, he said, when information was often more valuable than ammunition. "You were a scout?" Lydia asked one afternoon, watching him demonstrate how to lift papers without disturbing the order they'd been stacked in. "Among other things," Gideon's voice went distant. "They sent us behind enemy lines to gather intelligence. Sometimes we'd slip into Confederate camps, into officers' tents, and steal documents right from under their noses. It was terrifying work, but it taught me things most people never learn, like how to be invisible, like how to survive when everything's stacked against you." He handed her the papers. "Your turn. Show me you can put them back exactly as they were." The physical work continued too. Gideon pushed Lydia harder now, knowing she'd need every advantage strength could give her. They sparred with sticks in the snow, Gideon teaching her how to use an opponent's size against them, how to strike fast and hard and get away clean. Lydia fell more times than she could count, came away bruised and frustrated and determined. "Again," Gideon would say, offering his hand to pull her up, "you're getting better, but better's not good enough if Jacob gets his hands on you." "I know." Lydia would take his hand, let him pull her to her feet, and attack before he was ready. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes she'd catch him off guard and land a strike that made him grunt with surprise and approval. "Good," he'd say. "That's the instinct you need. Don't fight fair. Fight to win." But it wasn't all preparation and planning. There were moments of unexpected peace, too. Evenings when they'd sit by the fire and Gideon would pull out a battered harmonica, playing songs that sounded like loneliness and longing transformed into something almost beautiful. Mornings when Lydia would wake to find fresh snow had created a pristine world outside, untouched and perfect. And Gideon would make coffee and they'd drink it, watching the sun turn everything gold. And slowly, carefully, something grew between them that neither quite knew how to name. It started with small things. The way Gideon's hand would linger when he passed her something. The way Lydia found herself watching him when he worked, noticing the capable way he moved, the concentration on his face. They'd been living in close quarters for months now, sharing space and survival, and the careful distance they'd maintained was becoming harder to justify. One night, during a particularly fierce blizzard, they huddled close to the fire for warmth. The wind screamed through cracks in the cabin walls, despite their best efforts at chinking. Snow found its way in through gaps around the door. The temperature inside dropped so low they could see their breath. "Come here," Gideon said, opening his bedroll. "We need to share body heat or we'll freeze." Lydia hesitated only a moment before joining him. He wrapped the blankets around them both, his arms careful, respectful. But it was the first time they'd been this close since that night in the canyon when Jacob's men had nearly found them, and Lydia's heart hammered for entirely different reasons than fear. "Is this all right?" Gideon asked quietly. "Yes." And it was. His warmth was welcome, his presence steady and reassuring. Lydia found herself relaxing against him, her head resting on his shoulder, and realized with some surprise that she felt safe. Not the anxious, conditional safety of avoiding punishment, but genuine safety. The knowledge that this man would protect her without demanding payment for that protection. "Lydia," Gideon said after a while, his voice rough, "I need to tell you something." Her stomach tightened. "What?" "I care about you. More than I should, probably, given everything you've been through. And I know the timing's terrible. You're still healing from Jacob, still figuring out who you are outside that marriage." He paused, his breath warm against her hair. "But I needed you to know, before we go back to Dry Hollow, before things get dangerous, I needed you to know that you matter to me, that what we're doing isn't just about justice or revenge. It's about giving you the freedom to choose the life you want, Whatever that looks like. Lydia's throat constricted with emotion. Gideon, you don't have to say anything. I'm not asking for anything. Just, if something happens to me when we confront Jacob, I wanted you to know. She pulled back enough to look at him, seeing vulnerability written across his weathered features. Nothing's going to happen to you. We're going to do this smart, like you said. We're going to get the evidence, expose Jacob, and both of us are going to walk away free. You can't promise that. No, but I can promise that I care about you too. The words came easier than Lydia expected. I don't know what that means yet. Don't know what I'm capable of feeling after everything Jacob did. But I know I don't want to lose you, and I know that whatever future I build, I want you in it. Gideon's eyes searched hers, looking for certainty, for truth. Whatever he saw there made something in his expression soften. He lifted one hand, cupping her face gently, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. The kiss was careful, tentative, nothing like the brutal, demanding kisses Jacob had forced on her. This was a question, an offering, something she could accept or decline with no consequences either way. Lydia leaned into it, her hand coming up to rest against Gideon's chest, feeling his heart beat steady and strong beneath her palm. When they broke apart, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. We should sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Tomorrow and every day until spring. But Lydia was smiling, something bright and warm blooming in her chest. They settled back down in the shared bedroll, wrapped close for warmth and comfort and the simple human need for connection. The blizzard raged outside, but inside the cabin, Lydia felt something she'd thought lost forever. Hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope of survival, but the stronger, steadier hope of possibility. Of a future that might contain more than just freedom from fear. Maybe even happiness. The weeks passed. January gave way to February, and the worst of the winter weather began to ease. They'd survived. Not just survived, but grown stronger. Lydia could track game through the snow now, could skin and butcher what she caught, could shoot straight even in freezing wind. Her body had transformed from the thin, weak thing Jacob's cruelty had created into something capable and strong. You're ready, Gideon said one morning in late February, watching her take down 3 rabbits in quick succession. If we had to face Jacob tomorrow, you'd be ready. But we're not facing him tomorrow. Lydia collected her kills, already thinking about how to prepare them. The snow's still too deep. Another month at least before the pass opens. Another month to plan, to make sure we haven't missed anything. Gideon helped her carry the rabbits back to camp. We'll only get one chance at this, Lydia. If we go after Jacob and fail, if we can't make the charges stick, he'll bury us so deep no one will ever find our bodies. Then we don't fail. That afternoon, they went over the plan again, looking for weaknesses, for places where things could go wrong. The timing was critical. They'd need to reach Dry Hollow during the first Tuesday council meeting, get into Jacob's house, find the evidence, get out clean, then convince Mrs. Brennan to testify, gather any other witnesses who might be willing to speak up. What about Clara? Lydia asked. You said finding her would help establish a pattern. I sent letters before winter set in, to the wagon company, to contacts in Kansas City, anywhere I thought might have a lead. Gideon's expression was troubled. But I haven't heard back. For all I know, she's... He couldn't finish the sentence. She's alive, Lydia said with certainty she didn't quite feel. And if she is, if we can find her, she deserves the chance to face Jacob too, to make him answer for what he did to her. You're right. Gideon straightened his shoulders. When the thaw comes, first thing we do is check the trading post at Broken Ridge. See if any mail came through. If there's word about Clara, we follow it. If not, we proceed with what we have. The waiting was the hardest part. The snow began to melt in earnest in mid-March, turning the canyon into a muddy mess. The stream swelled with runoff. Ice broke off the waterfall in great crashing chunks. And every day, Lydia felt the tension building, anticipation mixed with dread, determination mixed with fear. Tell me about after, she said one evening. After we've dealt with Jacob. After all this is over. What then? Gideon considered the question carefully. I'd like to come back here, to this canyon, build a proper cabin, one that'll last more than a winter, maybe clear some land for a garden, set up a more permanent camp. Alone? He met her eyes. That depends on you. Lydia's heart stuttered. In the months since that first kiss, they'd been careful with each other, gentle, building trust slowly, learning each other's boundaries and needs. There'd been more kisses, quiet conversations in the dark, moments of closeness that felt both terrifying and right. But they hadn't talked about the future in concrete terms, hadn't put words to what was growing between them. "I don't know if I can be what you need," Lydia said honestly. "Jacob broke something in me. I don't know if I'll ever be able to." She gestured vaguely, unable to articulate the damage, the fear that intimacy might always feel like violation. "I'm not asking you to be anything except yourself." Gideon's voice was gentle. "Whatever you can give, that's enough. And whatever you can't, I'm not going to push. We've got time, Lydia. All the time in the world to figure out what works for us. And if I'm never ready, if I can't, then we'll be partners anyway, friends. Whatever works." He took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "I spent 15 years alone in these mountains because I was afraid of losing someone again. But I'm done being afraid. I'd rather have you in my life on whatever terms you can manage than not have you at all." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. "You're a good man, Gideon Rourke. I'm a patient man. There's a difference." But he was smiling. "Now come on, we've got about 2 weeks before the pass is clear enough to travel. Let's make sure we're ready." They spent those final weeks in a flurry of preparation. Gideon crafted a pack for Lydia that would let her carry supplies and weapons while keeping her hands free. They practiced their entry and exit strategies for Jacob's house until Lydia could execute them blindfolded. They rehearsed what they'd say to Mrs. Brennan, how they'd approach the territorial marshal, what evidence would be most damning. "Remember," Gideon said on their last night in the canyon, "we're not going there for revenge, we're going for justice. There's a difference." "I know." But Lydia's hand went to the pistol at her belt, the one Gideon had given her months ago, the one she could now shoot with deadly accuracy. "But if Jacob tries to hurt me again, then you defend yourself." "But we don't kill him, Lydia, not unless there's absolutely no other choice. A dead Jacob is a martyr, a living Jacob in prison for his crimes. That's justice." Lydia nodded, understanding the wisdom, even if part of her wanted to see Jacob suffer the way he'd made her suffer. But Gideon was right. This wasn't about revenge. It was about breaking the cycle, about making sure Jacob could never hurt another woman the way he'd hurt her and Clara. They left the canyon at dawn, the narrow entrance finally clear enough for the horse to pass through. Lydia looked back once, memorizing the place that had sheltered them through the winter, the place where she'd grown from a frightened, broken woman into someone capable of fighting back. "We'll come back," Gideon said quietly, reading her thoughts. "After this is done. We'll come back and build something permanent." The journey to Broken Ridge took 3 days. The trading post was a rough collection of buildings at the confluence of 2 rivers, a place where trappers and prospectors came to trade furs and supplies. Gideon had friends here, rough men who asked no questions and offered grudging respect. "Gideon Rourke," the trading post owner said when they walked in, "thought maybe you'd frozen up in the high country this winter." "Takes more than a hard winter to kill me, Sam." Gideon shook the man's hand. "Any mail come through for me?" Sam's expression grew serious. "Some. Been holding it since November. Figured you'd collect it come spring." He disappeared into a back room and returned with 3 letters, all bearing postmarks from Kansas City. Gideon's hands trembled slightly as he took them. "Thank you." They found a quiet corner of the trading post to read. The first letter was from the wagon company. Clara Whitfield had indeed been a passenger in 1871, destination Kansas City. The second was from a church registry. A Clara Whitfield had married a schoolteacher named Robert Ashford in 1873, currently residing on Maple Street. The third letter was from Clara herself. Gideon's breath caught as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. When he finished reading, he handed it to Lydia without a word. The letter was brief but powerful. Clara had received Gideon's inquiry through the church. Yes, she remembered everything that had happened in Dry Hollow. Yes, she would testify if it meant stopping Jacob from hurting anyone else. She'd built a good life in Kansas City, was married now, teaching at a school for girls. But the injustice of what Jacob and Benjamin had done still burned. If Gideon needed her, she would come. "She's alive," Lydia breathed. and she's willing to help. She's alive. Gideon's voice was thick with emotion. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. After all these years, wondering, fearing the worst, she's alive and safe and happy. We need to send word. Tell her when to meet us. They composed a reply immediately, explaining their plan to confront Jacob, asking Clara to travel to Dry Hollow for the second Tuesday in April, the next council meeting. That gave them 3 weeks to get to Dry Hollow, gather evidence, and prepare their case. After sending the letter, they restocked supplies and continued south. The land changed as they descended from the mountains, pine forests giving way to rolling hills, then to the flat plains that surrounded Dry Hollow. With every mile, Lydia felt the weight of what they were about to do settle heavier on her shoulders. "We can still turn back," Gideon said the night before they were due to reach town. "Find another way. Hide somewhere Jacob will never find you." "No," Lydia's voice was firm. "I'm done hiding, done letting fear dictate my choices. We're seeing this through." They rode into Dry Hollow on a Tuesday morning, exactly 4 months after Lydia had fled bound and bleeding through these same streets. The town looked the same. Shabby buildings, dusty roads, people going about their business with the same grim determination frontier life demanded. But Lydia was different. She sat straighter in the saddle now, her eyes scanning the streets with awareness instead of fear. Her hand rested easy on the pistol at her belt. She was ready. They left the horse at the livery, a different one than Jacob used, on the opposite side of town, paid the stable hand extra to keep quiet about new arrivals. Then they made their way carefully through the back streets toward Jacob's house. "Council meeting started an hour ago," Gideon murmured, checking the position of the sun. "That gives us maybe 3 hours before he comes back." They approached from behind using the cover of neighboring buildings and the cemetery Lydia had passed through on her wedding day. The house looked the same as she remembered, respectable, well-maintained, a monument to Jacob's carefully constructed image of civic responsibility. The back door was locked, but Lydia had the key. Her hand shook only slightly as she turned it, the soft click seeming impossibly loud in the quiet afternoon. Inside, the house smelled of dust and neglect. Jacob clearly hadn't been maintaining it properly without a wife to do the work. Lydia felt a grim satisfaction at that. Evidence that for all his complaints about her inadequacy, he'd relied on her more than he'd admitted. "Studies this way," she whispered, leading Gideon down the hall. The room was exactly as she remembered, dark wood paneling, heavy desk, liquor cabinet in the corner. She went straight for the cabinet, found the false bottom, retrieved the spare key with hands that had stopped shaking entirely. The desk drawer opened smoothly. Inside was the brown leather ledger, several bundles of letters tied with string, and various legal documents. Gideon pulled everything out, spreading it across the desk. "Look for payments to Mrs. Brennan," he said. "Anything that mentions Clara or Benjamin. Any correspondence that seems unusual." They worked quickly, methodically. Within 20 minutes, they'd found what they needed. The ledger contained detailed records of monthly payments to Martha Brennan, $50 each, marked as medical consultations. Letters from Benjamin to Jacob discussing the Clara problem and how to manage the situation. Even a letter from the town marshal, dated 1871, agreeing to handle the matter discreetly in exchange for Jacob's support in the next election. "It's all here," Lydia breathed. "Everything we need to prove what he did. Take it all. We'll sort through it properly later." Gideon was already gathering documents, tucking them into the pack they'd brought. "We need to—" The front door opened. They froze. Footsteps in the hall, heavy boots, male. Then Jacob's voice, angry and slurred. "Useless sons of bitches! Can't even run a simple council meeting without arguing about every damn detail." He was home early, drunk from the sound of it, and heading straight for the study. Gideon grabbed Lydia's arm, pulling her toward the window. But it was painted shut, hadn't been opened in years. They'd never get it open in time. The footsteps grew closer. Gideon positioned himself in front of Lydia, his hand on his knife. "Stay behind me," he whispered. "No matter what." The door swung open. Jacob stood in the doorway, his face already red from drink and afternoon heat. For one long moment, he simply stared at them. At Lydia alive and well, at Gideon standing protectively in front of her, at the open desk and scattered documents that told their own story. Then his expression twisted into something ugly and hateful and absolutely murderous. "You," he hissed, his hand going for the pistol at his belt. "You goddamn thieving!" Gideon moved before Jacob could clear leather. He closed the distance in 2 strides, his fist connecting with Jacob's jaw, with a crack that echoed through the house. Jacob staggered back, the pistol clattering to the floor. But he recovered faster than expected, grabbed a poker from the fireplace, swung it at Gideon's head with vicious intent. Gideon ducked, the poker whistling past his ear. He came up inside Jacob's guard, drove his shoulder into the other man's chest, sent them both crashing into the hallway. They grappled, Jacob fighting with the desperate fury of a cornered animal, Gideon fighting with cold precision. Lydia grabbed the fallen pistol, her hand steady despite the chaos. She could end this right now. 1 shot. Jacob would be dead and all their problems would be over, but Gideon's words echoed in her mind. "We're not going for revenge. We're going for justice." She leveled the pistol at Jacob instead. "Stop. Both of you. Stop right now or I swear I'll shoot." Her voice cut through the violence. Both men froze, breathing hard, bleeding from various cuts and scrapes. Jacob's eyes fixed on her, and she saw the calculation there, wondering if she had the nerve, if she'd really pull the trigger. "You won't," he said, his voice thick with contempt. "You're too weak, too broken. I made sure of—" Lydia fired. The bullet punched through the wall 6 inches from Jacob's head, close enough that he felt the heat of its passage. His face went white. "The next one goes through your knee," she said calmly. "After that, your other knee, then your elbows. I'll make sure you live, Jacob. Make sure you feel every bit of it. So I'd suggest you stop talking and start listening." Jacob's mouth worked soundlessly. Gideon used the moment to twist Jacob's arms behind his back, forcing him down onto his knees. "Here's what's going to happen," Lydia continued, the pistol never wavering. "We're taking you to the marshal. We're showing him the evidence of what you did to me, what you did to Clara Whitfield, what you've been doing for years. And you're going to confess." "Like hell I am," Jacob spat. "Then you'll go to trial. And we'll make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of man you really are." Lydia stepped closer, her voice dropping to something cold and sharp. "Either way, you're finished. The only question is whether you face justice with whatever dignity you have left, or whether we drag you there broken and bleeding." Jacob stared at her, seeing something in her eyes that made his bravado crack. This wasn't the frightened, beaten woman he'd dragged through the square 4 months ago. This was someone new, someone dangerous, someone he'd created through his own cruelty. "You can't prove anything," he tried weakly. "We have your ledger, your letters, and Clara's coming to testify." Lydia smiled without humor. "It's over, Jacob. You lost." They marched Jacob through the back streets toward the marshal's office, Gideon holding him by the arms while Lydia kept the pistol trained on his back. A few people noticed. Curtains twitched in windows. A shopkeeper paused mid-sweep to stare, but no one intervened. Maybe they sensed something had shifted, that the natural order Jacob had enforced for so long was finally crumbling. Marshal Davies looked up from his desk when they entered, his eyes widening at the sight. "What in the hell?" "We need to file charges," Lydia said, her voice steady. "Against Jacob Vale, for assault, conspiracy, administering poison with intent to harm, and obstruction of justice." The marshal stood slowly, his hand moving to his own weapon. "Now hold on just a minute. You can't come in here making wild accusations." "They're not wild," Gideon pushed Jacob into a chair. "And we have evidence. Documents from Jacob's own desk proving everything." "Evidence you stole by breaking into a man's home," Jacob snarled, finding his voice again. "That makes you criminals. Arrest them, Davies. They assaulted me in my own house." "After you tried to shoot us," Lydia countered. She pulled out the bundle of documents they'd taken, spreading them across the marshal's desk. "Read these." The ledger shows monthly payments to Martha Brennan for medical consultations. $50 a month for 3 years. Those weren't consultations. They were payments for the tonics she prepared. The tonics Jacob used to poison me. Marshal Davies picked up the ledger, his expression skeptical but curious. His eyes scanned the entries, and Lydia saw the moment doubt crept in. The payments were there, meticulous and damning. "This proves nothing," Jacob said, but there was desperation creeping into his voice now. "I paid Mrs. Brennan for legitimate medical care, for treatments to help my wife conceive. There's nothing criminal about that." "Then explain these." Gideon pulled out the letters from Benjamin. Your brother's correspondence discussing how to handle the Clara situation, how to manage the woman he assaulted, how grateful he was that you helped cover it up. The marshal's face went pale as he read. Jacob, is this true? Did this actually happen? My brother is dead and can't defend himself against these lies, Jacob said. But his eyes were wild now, darting between the door and the windows like a trapped animal looking for escape. You're going to take the word of a mountain savage and a hysterical woman over a respected member of this community? I'm going to follow the evidence. Marshal Davies set down the letters, his jaw tight. And right now the evidence suggests some serious crimes were committed. Jacob Vale, you're under arrest pending investigation. This is insane! Jacob lurched to his feet, but Gideon shoved him back down. You can't arrest me based on stolen documents and the word of, I can and I am. The marshal pulled out manacles. You'll get your chance to defend yourself at trial. But until then, you're staying in a cell. As Davies secured the chains around Jacob's wrists, the door to the marshal's office opened. Mrs. Brennan stood there, her face pale but determined. Behind her were 3 other women from town, Margaret Dunn, Sarah Prentice, and the seamstress Mrs. Calloway. Marshal, Mrs. Brennan said, her voice shaking but clear. I heard there was a commotion. I came because I need to confess something. Martha, don't, Jacob warned, his voice sharp with threat. You'll ruin yourself. Everything you've built is built on lies and cowardice. Mrs. Brennan stepped fully into the office, her hands clasped tight in front of her. I've been carrying this guilt for 3 years, Marshal. Jacob Vale paid me to prepare tonics for his wife. He told me they were fertility treatments, but they weren't. They were abortifacients, pennyroyal, tansy, black cohosh, herbs meant to prevent pregnancy or end it. The room went silent. Even Jacob seemed stunned by her admission. I kept records, Mrs. Brennan continued, pulling a small journal from her pocket. Every tonic I prepared, every payment I received. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I was afraid. Afraid of what Jacob would do to my business, my reputation. But I can't stay silent anymore. Not when I know he hurt that poor girl deliberately. Marshal Davies took the journal, comparing it to the ledger they'd already provided. The entries matched perfectly. Dates, amounts, everything. You stupid woman, Jacob hissed. You've destroyed us both. They'll run you out of town for this. Maybe they should. Mrs. Brennan's voice broke. Maybe that's what I deserve for being too much a coward to speak up sooner. You're speaking up now, Lydia said quietly. That takes more courage than you know. Margaret Dunn stepped forward next. I have something to say too, Marshal. I saw Jacob strike his wife last summer, behind the general store. She dropped a package and he hit her across the face so hard she fell. I pretended I didn't see it because I was afraid. But I saw it. And I'll testify to that. I heard them through the walls, Sarah Prentice added, her young face flushed with emotion. Late at night, Jacob shouting at her, calling her terrible things, and Mrs. Vale crying. I told my husband we should mind our business, but it's been eating at me ever since. One by one, the women confessed to the small cruelties they'd witnessed and stayed silent about. The pattern that emerged was devastating. Years of systematic abuse, all carefully hidden behind closed doors and the town's willingness to look away. Jacob's face had gone from red to white, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. You're all lying, conspiring against me because you're jealous of my position, my success. Enough. Marshal Davies' voice cut through the desperate denials. Jacob Vale, you're charged with assault, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and administering harmful substances with intent to cause bodily harm. The evidence is substantial, and the witness testimony corroborates the physical evidence. You'll stand trial, and a judge will decide your fate. On what authority? Jacob demanded. You're a town marshal, not a territorial judge. You can't... I can hold you until the circuit judge arrives next month, and I can ensure all this evidence is preserved and presented properly. Davies gestured to his deputy. Get him in a cell, and for the love of all that's decent, make sure he stays there. As they dragged Jacob away, he turned back one last time, his eyes fixed on Lydia with pure hatred. This isn't over. You think you've won, but you've just made yourself a target. There are people in this town who'll never forgive you for this. Then I'll deal with them too. Lydia's voice was calm. I'm done being afraid of you, Jacob, done letting you dictate the terms of my life. After Jacob was secured in the cell, Marshal Davies turned to the assembled group. I'm going to need formal statements from all of you, written testimony that can be presented at trial, and I need to warn you, this is going to get ugly. Jacob has friends, people who benefit from his position on the council. They're not going to take this lying down. Let them try, Mrs. Brennan said, and there was steel in her voice now. I'm done being silent, done letting powerful men get away with cruelty because it's easier than standing up to them. The other women murmured agreement. Something had shifted in Dry Hollow that afternoon, a crack in the foundation of fear and complicity that had kept everyone in line for so long. Over the next few days, more people came forward. The grocer who'd noticed Lydia growing thinner, the schoolteacher who'd heard Jacob berate her in public. Even some men spoke up, reluctantly, shamefacedly, admitting they'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't wanted to interfere in another man's marriage. The town began to divide along clear lines. Those who'd benefited from Jacob's influence rallied to his defense, claiming the charges were fabricated, that Lydia was a scorned wife seeking revenge. But more people, far more than Lydia had dared hope, spoke out in support. Women mostly, but some men too. People who'd been silenced by the same system that had protected Jacob for so long. Gideon stayed close to Lydia through it all, a steady presence as she gave her formal statement to the marshal, as she faced down the hostile stares of Jacob's supporters in the street, as she tried to process the surreal reality that people were finally listening. You're doing the right thing, he told her one evening as they sat in the boarding house where they'd taken rooms. I know it doesn't feel like it, not with half the town giving you dirty looks, but this matters. What you're doing matters. I keep waiting for it to fall apart, Lydia admitted, for the marshal to change his mind, or for Jacob to somehow talk his way out of this. It seems too good to be true that justice might actually be served. The evidence is solid. The witness testimony corroborates everything, and with Clara coming to testify, the door to their room burst open. A man Lydia didn't recognize stood there, breathing hard, his face flushed with anger. You're the one causing all this trouble. The one who's trying to destroy a good man's reputation. Gideon was on his feet instantly, positioning himself between Lydia and the intruder. Get out. Now. Not until I've had my say. The man stepped further into the room. Jacob Vale is a pillar of this community. A councilman, a businessman, a man who's contributed more to this town than you ever will. And you come here with your lies and your stolen documents? The documents aren't lies, Lydia said, standing despite her fear. They're proof, written in Jacob's own hand. Proof that can be misinterpreted by people with an agenda. You're nothing but a barren wife who couldn't fulfill her purpose, and now you're trying to destroy the man who gave you everything out of pure vindictiveness. Gideon's hand moved to his knife. You've got 3 seconds to leave before I make you leave. The man's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but he stood his ground. The truth will come out at trial. And when it does, when everyone sees you for the liar you are, the truth is already out. Mrs. Brennan appeared in the doorway, with Margaret Dunn and Sarah Prentice behind her. I confessed to poisoning that girl on Jacob's orders. I have the records to prove it. So unless you're calling me a liar too, Mr. Patterson, I suggest you leave these people alone. Patterson looked between the women, seeing the united front they presented. Something in his expression shifted, not quite acceptance, but a recognition that the battle lines had been drawn and he was on the losing side. This isn't over, he muttered, but he left. After he was gone, Lydia sank back onto the bed, her hands shaking. How many more of those are we going to face? However many it takes, Mrs. Brennan said firmly. We outnumber them, Lydia. We just never realized it before because we were all isolated, all convinced we were alone in our doubts. But we're not alone anymore. The women stayed for another hour, sharing their own stories of times they'd been silenced or dismissed, times they'd witnessed injustice and felt powerless to stop it. By the time they left, Lydia felt something she hadn't expected, the beginning of community, real community, built on truth and support rather than fear and compliance. You're changing this town, Gideon said after they'd gone, whether you meant to or not. I just wanted justice, for myself and for Clara. And you're getting it. But you're also showing other women that they don't have to accept cruelty as normal, that they can speak up, fight back, demand better. Gideon sat beside her, taking her hand. That's bigger than one trial. That's changing the whole system. 2 weeks later, Clara arrived. Lydia watched from the boarding house window as the stage pulled up, saw a slender woman in a traveling dress step down. Even from a distance, she could see the resemblance to the girl in the letter. The same dark hair, the same determined set to her shoulders. Gideon was already moving toward the door, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for his coat. I should go, Lydia said gently. I'll give you time. She watched from the window as Gideon approached Clara on the street, saw the moment Clara recognized him, the way her hand flew to her mouth. Then they were embracing, both of them crying, 6 years of separation and grief and wondering finally released. Lydia felt tears prick her own eyes. This was what they'd been fighting for, not just punishment for Jacob, but restoration of what he'd tried to destroy. Connection. Love. The possibility of building something good from the ashes of trauma. Eventually, Gideon and Clara made their way to the boarding house. Clara's eyes were red from crying, but her smile was genuine when she took Lydia's hands. Thank you, she said simply, for being brave enough to stand up to him, for giving me the chance to face what happened instead of running from it forever. I should thank you, Lydia replied. Without your letter, without knowing what Jacob did to you, I might have thought I was alone, that what happened to me was somehow unique. That's what men like Jacob count on, women staying isolated, convinced their suffering is individual rather than systemic. Clara's voice was fierce. But we're not isolated anymore. And tomorrow, when I testify, he's going to learn what it costs to underestimate us. They spent the evening preparing Clara's testimony, going over the events of 1871 in careful detail. Clara's memory was sharp, her anger still fresh despite the years that had passed. I've built a good life, she told them. I have a husband who treats me with kindness and respect, students who look up to me, a community that values my contributions. But there's always been this shadow, this unfinished business with Jacob, the knowledge that he destroyed my life and faced no consequences. He'll face them now, Gideon said quietly. I know, and that's why I came. Clara looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since arriving. You're different than I remember, harder, but also, I don't know, more settled in yourself somehow. 15 years in the mountains will do that. Gideon glanced at Lydia, and having someone worth coming back from the wilderness for helps. The look that passed between him and Lydia made Clara smile. I'm glad. You deserve happiness, Thomas. You always did. So do you. And I'm glad you found it. There was healing in that exchange, Lydia realized. The last threads of what might have been finally released, allowing both of them to fully embrace what actually was. Clara had her life in Kansas City, her husband, her students. Gideon had his mountains, his freedom, and now Lydia. The past would always be part of them, but it didn't have to define them anymore. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the next morning. The courtroom was packed. Seemed like half of Dry Hollow had turned out to watch. Jacob sat at the defense table with his lawyer, a sharp-faced man brought in from Silver Ridge, who kept shooting hostile looks at the prosecution's side. Judge Harrison, a stern man in his 60s who'd traveled from the territorial capital, called the proceedings to order. We're here to determine if sufficient evidence exists to proceed to trial in the matter of the territory versus Jacob Vale. The charges are serious: assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy to obstruct justice, administering poison with intent to harm. Mr. Prosecutor, present your case. The territorial prosecutor, a woman named Elizabeth Marsh, stood and began methodically laying out the evidence. She presented the ledger showing payments to Mrs. Brennan, the letters from Benjamin discussing the cover-up, the journal detailing which tonics had been prepared and when. Then she called her first witness. Mrs. Brennan took the stand, her hands trembling but her voice steady. She testified to every detail, how Jacob had approached her, what he'd paid her for, the specific herbs she'd used, and their known effects. When Jacob's lawyer tried to suggest she was lying to save herself, she pulled out a second set of records she'd kept hidden, even more detailed than the first. I knew what I was doing was wrong, she said, tears streaming down her face. But I was afraid. Jacob Vale has had enormous power in this town. He could have ruined me with a word, but I kept these records because some part of me knew that someday someone would need proof. Someone would be brave enough to stand up to him. Margaret Dunn testified next, describing the assault she'd witnessed behind the general store. Sarah Prentice spoke about the sounds of abuse she'd heard through shared walls. One by one, the witnesses built a picture of systematic cruelty that was impossible to dismiss. Then it was Lydia's turn. She walked to the stand with her head high, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. Jacob stared at her with undisguised hatred, but she didn't look away. Didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing fear. "Mrs. Vale," Prosecutor Marsh began, "please tell the court about your marriage to Jacob Vale." Lydia took a breath and began. She detailed the advertisement that had brought her to Dry Hollow, the promises Jacob had made, the reality she'd discovered. She described the escalating violence, the public humiliations, the tonics that had made her so sick. "I thought I was broken," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "Jacob told me repeatedly that my inability to conceive was my failure, my deficiency. It never occurred to me that he might be deliberately preventing pregnancy. Not until I was away from him, away from his constant reinforcement of that narrative. Then I started to question, to remember, and the pieces fell into place." "Do you believe you were pregnant at any point during your marriage?" Marsh asked. "Yes, 3 times, I believe. The symptoms matched, the nausea, the tenderness, the cessation of my monthly courses. But each time, shortly after Jacob would have noticed the changes, Mrs. Brennan would appear with a new tonic. And each time, within days of drinking it, I would experience terrible cramping and bleeding. Bleeding that wasn't normal." Jacob's lawyer stood. "Objection. Mrs. Vale is not a medical expert. She can't possibly know whether she was pregnant or what caused any bleeding she experienced." "Sustained," Judge Harrison said. "Stick to what you directly observed, Mrs. Vale." Lydia nodded. "I observed that I showed signs consistent with early pregnancy. I observed that I was given tonics by Mrs. Brennan at my husband's direction. And I observed that after consuming those tonics, I became violently ill and lost any signs of pregnancy I'd been experiencing. I'll leave it to medical experts to determine the connection." The testimony continued for hours. Jacob's lawyer tried repeatedly to shake her story, to paint her as vindictive or unreliable. But Lydia had spent months preparing for this, had lived the truth of it for 3 years. She answered every question calmly, precisely, letting the facts speak for themselves. Finally, it was Clara's turn. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as she took the stand. Jacob had gone pale the moment she'd entered, clearly not believing she'd actually show up. "Miss Whitfield," Marsh began, "please tell the court what happened in the spring of 1871. Clara's voice was steady as she recounted Benjamin's assault, Gideon's intervention, and the systematic cover-up that followed. She described how Jacob had threatened both her and Gideon, how he'd used his influence to turn the entire town against her, how she'd been driven out with nothing but the clothes on her back and $20. "And why did you agree to come here today?" Marsh asked. "After building a new life, why subject yourself to this ordeal?" "Because justice delayed is not justice denied," Clara said, looking directly at Jacob. "Because I've carried the weight of what happened to me for 6 years, and I'm tired of being the only one who carries it. Jacob Vale destroyed my life once. He tried to destroy Lydia's life the same way. And if we don't stop him now, he'll do it again to someone else. I came here to make sure that doesn't happen." When Clara stepped down, Jacob was visibly shaking. His lawyer tried to discredit her testimony, to suggest she was bitter about being rejected by Benjamin. But the letters they'd found demolished that narrative. Benjamin's own words admitting to the assault, Jacob's correspondence arranging the cover-up. Judge Harrison adjourned for the day, announcing he'd deliver his ruling on whether to proceed to trial the next morning. But anyone watching his face could see the decision was already made. That night, Lydia, Gideon, and Clara sat together in the boarding house parlor. They were exhausted, wrung out from the emotional toll of reliving their traumas in public. But there was also a sense of accomplishment, of having finally spoken truths that had been suppressed for too long. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Clara said, "this was worth it. Getting to stand up in front of Jacob and everyone else, getting to tell my story without shame or apology, that was worth the journey." "He looked terrified," Lydia observed, "when you were testifying, like he'd seen a ghost." "In a way, he had." Clara smiled without humor. "He thought he'd buried me. buried the truth of what happened. But here I am, alive and well, and telling everyone exactly what he did. Gideon had been quiet most of the evening, but now he spoke. I owe you an apology, Clara, for not fighting harder, for letting them drive you away. Stop, Clara took his hand. We were children trying to stand against a system designed to protect men like Jacob. We did what we could with what we had. And now we're finishing it together. The next morning, Judge Harrison delivered his ruling. Sufficient evidence existed to proceed to full trial on all charges. Jacob Vale would remain in custody pending the trial date, set for 3 weeks hence. The courtroom erupted in noise, some people cheering, others protesting. Jacob sat frozen at the defense table, his carefully constructed world finally, irrevocably shattered. As they led him back to his cell, he caught Lydia's eye one last time. She expected to see hatred there, or rage, or the murderous intent that had characterized so many of their interactions. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like bewilderment, a complete inability to understand how the natural order, his natural order, had been so thoroughly upended. Lydia felt no pity, only relief, and the beginning of something that might eventually become peace. The 3 weeks until trial passed in a blur of continued preparation and growing community support. More women came forward with their own stories of times they'd been silenced or hurt. The divide in Dry Hollow deepened, but so did the solidarity on the side of truth and justice. And through it all, Lydia felt herself changing in ways she was only beginning to understand. The frightened, broken woman who'd been dragged through the square was gone, replaced by someone stronger. Someone who'd learned she could face her demons and win. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in late April, with clouds gathering over Dry Hollow like witnesses to judgment. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, people standing in the aisles and crowding the doorway. Judge Harrison had to bang his gavel 3 times before the noise settled to a tense, expectant silence. Jacob sat at the defense table looking diminished somehow, his expensive suit hanging loose on a frame that had lost weight during his weeks in jail. His lawyer, a man named Wilton, shuffled papers with the nervous energy of someone who knew his case was weak but was being paid too much to walk away. Prosecutor Marsh stood and addressed the jury, 12 men from surrounding counties, brought in specifically because Judge Harrison had determined that finding impartial jurors in Dry Hollow itself would be impossible. "Gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice clear and carrying, "over the next few days you're going to hear testimony about a man who used his position of power and respect to systematically destroy the women in his life. You'll hear about deliberate poisoning, about conspiracy to cover up assault, about a pattern of cruelty that spans years and multiple victims. The evidence will show that Jacob Vale is not the upstanding citizen he's pretended to be, but rather a calculating predator who believed his standing in the community put him above consequences." Wilton objected immediately. "Your Honor, the prosecution is prejudicing the jury with inflammatory language." "Overruled," Judge Harrison said. "The opening statement is the prosecution's opportunity to preview their case. You'll get your chance, Mr. Wilton. Proceed, Miss Marsh." The prosecution built their case methodically over 3 days. Mrs. Brennan testified again, this time with medical experts who explained exactly what the herbs she'd prepared would do to a woman's body. The doctor was blunt. The combination of pennyroyal, tansy, and black cohosh was a known abortifacient used specifically to prevent or end pregnancies. "In your medical opinion," Marsh asked, "if a woman consumed these herbs regularly over a 3-year period, what would be the likely result?" "She would be unable to carry a pregnancy to term," the doctor replied. "The herbs would either prevent implantation entirely or cause early miscarriage. It's actually remarkable that Mrs. Vale survived 3 years of this treatment. Many women would have suffered permanent damage or death from the toxicity." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Lydia felt Gideon's hand find hers, squeezing gently. Wilton cross-examined aggressively, trying to suggest that Mrs. Brennan had prepared the tonics incorrectly, that Jacob couldn't have known what they contained. But Mrs. Brennan held firm. "Mr. Vale specified exactly which herbs to use," she said. "He brought me books, articles he'd found. He knew precisely what those tonics would do, and he paid me very well to ensure I followed his instructions exactly." The testimony about Clara came next. She took the stand with quiet dignity, recounting the assault and its aftermath in detail that left several jury members visibly uncomfortable. When she described how Jacob had orchestrated her expulsion from town, one of the jurors actually shook his head in disgust. "Miss Whitfield," Marsh said, "you've built a new life in Kansas City. You're married, teaching at a respected school. Why risk that by coming here to testify?" "Because silence protects perpetrators, not victims," Clara replied. "Because I've spent 6 years living with the knowledge that Jacob Vale faced no consequences for destroying my life. And because when I heard he'd done the same thing to another woman, that he'd followed the exact same pattern, I knew I had a moral obligation to speak up, to make sure everyone understood this wasn't an isolated incident. This is who Jacob Vale is." Wilton tried to paint Clara as a scorned woman seeking revenge, but she deflected every attempt with calm precision. The letters from Benjamin and Jacob entered into evidence made it impossible to deny that a cover-up had occurred. Then it was Lydia's turn to testify again, this time for the full trial. She took the stand feeling the weight of the moment. This was her chance to tell the complete truth, to make the jury understand what 3 years of systematic abuse had been like. Marsh walked her through everything chronologically. The advertisement that had brought her to Dry Hollow, the initial courtship that had seemed promising, the slow revelation of Jacob's true nature, the escalating violence, the forced tonics, the public humiliation that had finally driven her to flee. "Mrs. Vale," Marsh said, "in your own words, what was your husband's goal in poisoning you?" "Control," Lydia answered, "as long as I couldn't conceive he had a reason to punish me, a socially acceptable reason. Everyone in Dry Hollow believed I was the problem, that I'd failed in my primary duty as a wife. That gave Jacob license to treat me however he wanted. If I'd gotten pregnant, carried to term, I would have had value. Standing, protection under law as a mother. He couldn't allow that." "Objection!" Wilton was on his feet. "Pure speculation. Mrs. Vale cannot possibly know her husband's motivations." "I'll allow it," Judge Harrison said. "She lived with the man for 3 years. She's entitled to draw conclusions from his behavior." The cross-examination was brutal. Wilton tried every tactic, suggesting Lydia was naturally barren and blamed Jacob for her own inadequacy, implying she'd been unfaithful and fled to cover her shame, even hinting that she and Gideon had conspired to frame Jacob as revenge for his brother's death. But Lydia had prepared for this. She met every accusation with calm facts, always bringing the conversation back to the evidence. "The ledger shows payments," she said. "The journal shows what tonics were prepared. Medical experts confirmed those tonics would prevent pregnancy. Those are facts, Mr. Wilton. Everything else is just your attempt to distract from them." The turning point came when Wilton made a mistake. He asked Lydia why, if Jacob had been so terrible, she hadn't simply left earlier. "Where would I have gone?" Lydia's voice was quiet but intense. "I had no money, no family, no friends in Dry Hollow, because Jacob had isolated me from everyone. And I'd been taught, by him, by the town, by society itself, that a wife's place was with her husband no matter what, that enduring cruelty was my duty, that speaking up would only make things worse." She leaned forward, holding Wilton's gaze. "You're asking why I didn't leave. I'm asking why everyone watched it happen and did nothing. Why no one questioned a man dragging his wife through the streets like an animal. Why the silence of this entire community was more important than one woman's suffering." The courtroom was dead silent. Several of the women in the gallery were crying. Even some of the jurors looked uncomfortable, confronted with their own complicity in systems that allowed abuse to flourish. Wilton had no response. He sat down, and Lydia was dismissed. The defense's case was weak. Wilton called character witnesses who testified to Jacob's civic contributions, his business acumen, his role as a respected councilman. But under cross-examination, nearly all of them admitted they'd never been inside Jacob's home, had never observed his private behavior, knew nothing about how he treated his wife behind closed doors. Jacob himself chose not to testify, likely because his lawyer knew the prosecution would destroy him on cross-examination. It was a tactical decision, but it left the defense with little to work with. The closing arguments came on the 4th day. Wilton did his best to create reasonable doubt, suggesting the evidence could be interpreted multiple ways, that the testimonies were coordinated fabrications by women with an agenda. But Marcia's closing was devastating. She walked the jury through the timeline, showing how everything fit together. The payments, the tonics, the medical effects, The pattern established by what had happened to Clara. She reminded them of the letters in Jacob's own hand, the meticulous records Mrs. Brennan had kept, the physical scars still visible on Lydia's wrists. Jacob Vale is a man who believed his position made him untouchable, she concluded, who thought he could destroy women's lives without consequence because society had always protected men like him. The question you must answer is simple. Will you continue that protection, or will you hold him accountable for his crimes? The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they filed back in, the foreman's expression was grim. Judge Harrison asked for the verdict. On the charge of assault with a deadly weapon, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to obstruct justice, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of administering poison with intent to harm, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered, others protested loudly. Jacob sat frozen, his face white with shock, as if he genuinely believed until that moment that he'd somehow escaped justice. Judge Harrison gavelled for order. Jacob Vale, you have been found guilty of serious crimes against the women in your life. Sentencing will take place tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Until then, you will remain in custody. That evening, Lydia stood on the boarding house porch watching the sun set over Dry Hollow. The town looked peaceful in the golden light, but she knew the peace was deceptive. Change was coming. Uncomfortable, necessary change that would force everyone to reckon with what they'd allowed to happen. Gideon came to stand beside her, his shoulder touching hers. How are you feeling? Strange, Lydia admitted. I thought I'd feel triumphant, vindicated. But mostly I just feel tired and sad for all the years this could have been stopped if someone had just been willing to listen. You can't carry that weight. The complicity of an entire town, that's not your burden. I know, but I can't help thinking about other women. The ones who didn't have someone like you willing to intervene. The ones who are still trapped in situations like mine was convinced they're alone. Lydia turned to face him. What do we do about them? We show them what's possible. We prove that speaking up can lead to justice. And we make sure the systems that protected Jacob get torn down and rebuilt better. Gideon took her hand. You've already started that work, Lydia. What you did here, it's going to ripple out. Other women will hear about this trial. They'll know they don't have to suffer in silence. Clara joined them on the porch, her traveling bag already packed for the journey back to Kansas City. I'm leaving on tomorrow's stage, she said. After the sentencing, my husband is worried about me, and I miss my students. Thank you for coming, Lydia said, for being brave enough to face him again. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Clara smiled, and it was genuine. I've carried this anger for 6 years. It's been like a stone in my chest, weighing me down even when I was happy. But standing up there, telling the truth, watching Jacob's face as his world fell apart, that stone is gone now. I can finally breathe. They stood together watching the stars emerge, 3 people bound by shared trauma and shared victory. Tomorrow would bring sentencing. Then Clara would go back to her life in Kansas City. Gideon and Lydia would decide what came next for them. But tonight, they simply existed in the quiet satisfaction of having fought and won. The sentencing hearing the next morning was brief. Judge Harrison listened to Wilton's plea for leniency, citing Jacob's age and previous good standing in the community. Then he delivered his judgment. Jacob Vale, you have been convicted of crimes that demonstrate a profound disregard for the safety and dignity of the women in your life. You used your position of power to perpetrate systematic abuse, to cover up assault, and to poison your own wife in order to maintain control over her. The evidence shows this was not impulsive behavior, but calculated, deliberate cruelty sustained over years. Jacob stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. Taking into account the severity of the crimes, the duration of the abuse, and the need to send a clear message that such behavior will not be tolerated in this territory, I hereby sentence you to 15 years of hard labor in the territorial prison. 15 years. Lydia felt something release in her chest, relief so profound it was almost painful. Jacob would be an old man when he got out, if he survived that long. His power, his influence, his ability to hurt anyone, all of it stripped away. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, I am ordering that Jacob Vale forfeit all assets acquired during his marriage to Lydia Vale, as they were obtained through fraud and maintained through criminal behavior. Mrs. Vale will receive appropriate compensation for her suffering. Jacob finally reacted, his head whipping toward the judge. You can't. Those assets are mine. Legally acquired. Through a marriage entered into under false pretenses and maintained through criminal abuse, Harrison said coldly. The law allows for asset forfeiture in cases of fraud. Your marriage was fraud from the beginning. Take him away. As the deputies led Jacob out in chains, he turned back one last time. His eyes found Lydia, and she saw something in them she'd never seen before. Fear. Real, genuine fear of what the future held. She felt nothing. No satisfaction, no pity, no lingering anger. Just the vast, peaceful emptiness of a burden finally set down. Outside the courthouse, the women who'd testified gathered around Lydia. Mrs. Brennan was crying openly. Margaret Dunn squeezed Lydia's hand. Young Sarah Prentice looked at her with something like awe. You did it, Sarah said. You actually made them listen. We did it, Lydia corrected. Every person who testified, who spoke up, who chose truth over comfort, that's what made this happen. What will you do now? Mrs. Brennan asked. Will you stay in Dry Hollow? Lydia looked at Gideon, who stood a few feet away, giving her space for this moment with the women. He met her eyes and smiled, and she felt that warmth in her chest again, the possibility of happiness, of building something good from all this pain. No, she said. There's a valley in the mountains, a place where Gideon and I plan to build a cabin, start over somewhere no one knows our history. But I'll come back to visit, to check on things, to make sure the changes we started here actually stick. Will you marry him? Sarah asked, then blushed. I'm sorry, that's too personal. Maybe, Lydia smiled. Someday, when I'm ready to think of marriage as partnership instead of ownership, when I can stand before someone and make promises without fear. She looked at the young girl seriously. But there's no rush. I have time to figure out who I am outside of being someone's wife. Time to learn what I want instead of just reacting to what I don't want. Clara appeared from the courthouse, having said her goodbyes to Gideon privately. She embraced Lydia one last time. You have my address. Write to me. Let me know how you're doing. I will. And you do the same. Lydia held her tight. Thank you for being so brave, for showing me what it looks like to survive this and build a real life after. You're going to build an even better one. Clara pulled back, smiling through tears. I can feel it. You and Gideon, you're going to be happy. After Clara left on the afternoon stage, Lydia and Gideon collected their things from the boarding house. The settlement from Jacob's assets would take weeks to process, but Marshall Davies had advanced Lydia enough money to buy supplies for the journey back to the mountains. You sure about this? Gideon asked as they prepared to leave Dry Hollow for the last time. Once we head into the high country, we'll be snowed in again by November. 6 months of just you and me and whatever we can hunt or grow. I'm sure. Lydia swung into her saddle. They'd bought a second horse with the advance money and felt the rightness of it settle in her bones. I've spent enough time in towns where everyone watches and judges. I'm ready for somewhere quiet, somewhere I can figure out who I am without an audience. They rode out of Dry Hollow as the sun climbed toward noon. A few people watched them go, some with hostility, some with respect, most with simple curiosity about what would happen to the woman who'd brought down one of their leading citizens. Lydia didn't look back. The journey to the Box Canyon took a week, and every mile felt like shedding another layer of the past. By the time they rode through the narrow entrance into the hidden valley, Lydia felt lighter than she had in years. The cabin they'd built over the winter was still standing, weathered but sound. They spent the first few days making improvements, replacing boards that had rotted, strengthening the roof, clearing brush from around the structure. Then they began the work of making it a real home. Gideon taught Lydia how to build furniture from logs, a proper table, chairs, a bed frame. She planted a garden in the sunny meadow using seeds they'd bought in town. They worked side by side through the long summer days, and slowly the cabin transformed from a survival shelter into something that felt permanent, chosen. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire and talk about the future, about expanding the cabin, maybe adding a second room, about building a smokehouse for preserving meat, about the possibility of raising chickens or goats, plans that assumed a future together, though neither of them pushed for formal commitment. I got a letter from Clara, Gideon said one evening in late June. She and her husband want us to visit Kansas City. Says she'd like to introduce you to her students, show them what courage looks like. Maybe next spring, Lydia said, after we've had a full year to ourselves, after I've had time to really settle into who I'm becoming. No rush. Gideon's hand found hers across the space between their chairs. We've got all the time in the world. Summer deepened into August, then September. The aspen leaves turned gold, then fell in drifts that crunched under their boots. They hunted and preserved meat for the winter, chopped enough firewood to see them through the cold months, watched the first snow dust the high peaks, knowing the heavy snows would come soon. One evening in early October, Lydia stood at the edge of the meadow watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. She felt Gideon coming up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. How different everything is from a year ago. Lydia leaned back against him, comfortable with the closeness in a way that still sometimes surprised her. This time last year, I was still married to Jacob. Still convinced I was broken, defective, worthless. And now you're strong, capable, free. Now I'm myself, Lydia corrected. For the first time in my life, I'm just me. Not someone's daughter or wife or property, just Lydia, figuring out what that means. Gideon turned her to face him, his weathered face serious in the fading light. And what does it mean? What do you want, Lydia Vale? She considered the question carefully. A year ago, she wouldn't have known how to answer, would have looked to someone else to tell her what she should want, what was acceptable to desire, but now she knew. I want this, she said simply. This valley, this cabin, this life we're building. I want the freedom to make my own choices, good or bad. I want to keep learning how to survive, how to thrive, how to be strong without being hard. She paused, meeting his eyes. And I want you. Not because I need you to rescue me or protect me, but because I choose you. Because building a life with you feels right in a way nothing else ever has. Gideon's eyes shone with emotion. I want that too, all of it. But Lydia, I need you to know you don't owe me anything. What we have, what we're building, it only works if we're both choosing it freely. I know. Lydia took his hands, feeling the calluses that matched her own. That's why it works. Because for the first time in my life, I'm not being told what to want or who to be. I'm choosing. And I choose this. I choose you. I choose us. They stood in the fading light, two people who'd survived their own separate hells and found each other in the aftermath. The kiss was gentle, full of promise rather than demand, a beginning rather than a conclusion. We should probably talk about making this official at some point, Gideon said eventually. Not marriage necessarily, not if that word carries too much weight for you, but some kind of commitment, partnership. Someday, Lydia agreed, when I can stand in front of people and make promises without my hands shaking, when marriage feels like choice instead of obligation. She smiled. But we don't need a ceremony to make this real. We're already building a life together. That's more real than any legal document. They went inside as the stars emerged, lighting the lanterns against the gathering darkness. The cabin was warm and solid around them, a shelter they'd built with their own hands. Tomorrow they'd continue the work. There was always more to do before winter locked them in. But tonight, they simply existed in the peace they'd fought so hard to find. Winter came hard and fast, snow piling deep around the cabin, but they were ready for it. The larder was full, the woodpile high, the cabin chinked tight against the cold. They settled into the rhythm of winter living, tending the fire, preparing meals, working on projects that would keep their hands busy through the long, dark months. Lydia spent hours working on a quilt, piecing together scraps of fabric into something beautiful and useful. Gideon carved furniture and tools, his skilled hands creating practical art. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire and read. Gideon had brought books from the trading post, stories and histories that opened worlds beyond the valley. And slowly, carefully, Lydia learned what intimacy could be when it was freely given rather than taken by force. Learned that closeness didn't have to mean vulnerability, that trust could be built through patience and respect. Some nights they shared the bed as partners learning each other. Other nights Lydia needed space, and Gideon gave it without complaint or resentment. "Thank you," she said one night as they lay in the darkness, the fire burning low. For being patient, for never pushing. Thank you for trusting me enough to try. Gideon's fingers traced gentle patterns on her arm. I spent so many years alone, I forgot what it felt like to be close to someone. You're teaching me too, Lydia, how to be present, how to build something lasting. Spring came eventually, as it always did. The snow melted, the creek swelled with runoff, green shoots pushed up through the earth. They emerged from the cabin into a world renewed, ready to continue building. A letter arrived in May, brought by a trapper passing through. It was from Clara, full of news about her life in Kansas City and questions about theirs. Lydia wrote back, describing the valley, the cabin, the peace they'd found. She included an invitation. Come visit sometime, see what we've built. Summer brought other visitors too. Mrs. Brennan arrived in July, older and grayer but with her spine straight and her eyes clear. She'd closed her practice in Dry Hollow, she said, unable to continue living in a place where she'd done such harm. She was heading to California, to a daughter she hadn't seen in 20 years. I wanted to stop here first, she told Lydia, to see that you were all right, to apologize again for my part in your suffering. You spoke up when it mattered, Lydia said. That takes more courage than avoiding the harm in the first place. I forgive you, Mrs. Brennan, and I hope you find peace in California. The older woman cried, then smiled, then continued her journey west, looking lighter than when she'd arrived. In August, Marshal Davies came through with news from Dry Hollow. Jacob had died in prison. A fever had swept through the facility, taking several inmates, including him. The marshal delivered the news without ceremony, watching Lydia's face for her reaction. She felt nothing, no grief, no relief, no satisfaction, just the quiet knowledge that a chapter was finally irrevocably closed. There's something else, Davies said. The town council has been dissolved. Too many members were implicated in various cover-ups over the years. They're rebuilding from scratch, trying to do it right this time. Several women are being appointed to positions of authority. Things are changing. Good, Lydia said. Maybe the next woman who needs help will actually get it. After Davies left, Gideon found Lydia by the creek, staring at her reflection in the clear water. How do you feel? He asked. Free, she said simply. He's gone. The fear that he might somehow escape, might come after me again, that's gone too. It's really over. So what now? Lydia stood, brushing dirt from her skirts. Now we keep building. We live the life we've chosen. We help other people who need it, if they come through. We grow old together in this valley, surrounded by peace. She took his hand. That's enough. That's more than enough. As autumn painted the valley in golds and reds, Lydia and Gideon stood together, looking at the cabin they'd expanded, the garden they'd cultivated, the life they'd built from nothing but determination and hope. I've been thinking, Gideon said one evening as they watched the sunset, about what you said last year, about making promises when you were ready. Lydia's heart beat faster. And? I don't need a ceremony or legal documents. I don't need the approval of any town or official. He turned to face her, taking both her hands. But I want you to know I'm committed to this. To you. To building this life together for as long as we both choose it. That's my promise. And mine, Lydia said, tears pricking her eyes. For as long as we both choose it. Partners. Equals. Free. They sealed it with a kiss as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting their valley in shades of gold and promise. The years passed. The cabin grew, first an additional room, then a small barn, then a proper smokehouse. The garden expanded, producing enough that they could trade surplus at the trading post for things they couldn't make themselves. Trappers and travelers began to know about the couple in the hidden valley, the woman who'd brought down a corrupt councilman and the mountain man who'd helped her do it. Sometimes people came seeking refuge, fleeing situations like the one Lydia had escaped. She and Gideon always helped, offering shelter and teaching survival skills and connecting people with resources. The valley became known as a safe place, a haven for those who needed to disappear and rebuild. Clara visited twice, bringing her husband and later her children. She and Lydia maintained a correspondence that spanned decades, two survivors who'd found their own versions of peace and happiness. And through it all, Lydia continued to grow into herself. The frightened girl who'd answered a newspaper advertisement was gone entirely, replaced by a woman who knew her own strength, who'd learned that freedom was worth fighting for, who'd discovered that surviving trauma didn't mean you were broken. It meant you were strong enough to heal. On a summer evening 20 years after that terrible morning in the square, Lydia sat on the porch of the cabin watching the stars emerge. Gideon sat beside her, his hair grayer now, his face more lined, but his eyes still steady and kind. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Giving up your solitary life in the mountains for this?" "Never." Gideon took her hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "You saved me as much as I saved you, Lydia. You taught me that connection wasn't weakness, that building something with another person could be stronger than anything I could build alone." "We saved each other," Lydia said. "That's how it works when it's real partnership." They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them. Somewhere in the valley, an owl called. The creek burbled over stones, the wind sighed through the pines, and Lydia Vale, no longer defined by marriage or suffering or anyone else's expectations, smiled into the darkness, completely at peace with the life she'd chosen, the person she'd become, and the future that stretched ahead full of possibility and promise. The rope had been cut decades ago. She would never be dragged again. And in the mountains where she'd learned to be free, she'd also learned to be happy. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and unchanging, witnesses to one woman's journey from victim to survivor to something even more powerful. A woman who'd learned that justice was possible, that healing was real, and that freedom, once claimed, could be held on to for a lifetime.